Chapter 1 of Hannibal. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Hollis Hanover. Hannibal by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 1. The First Punic War. Hannibal was a Carthaginian general. He acquired his great distinction as a warrior by his desperate contests with the Romans. Rome and Carthage grew up together on opposite sides of the Mediterranean Sea. For about 100 years they waged against each other most dreadful wars. There were 3 of these wars. Rome was successful in the end, and Carthage was entirely destroyed. There was no real cause for any disagreement between these two nations. Their hostility to each other was merely rivalry and spontaneous hate. They spoke a different language, they had a different origin, and they lived on opposite sides of the same sea, so they hated and devoured each other. Those who have read the story of Alexander the Great in this series will recollect the difficulty he experienced in besieging and subduing Tyre, a great maritime city, situated about 2 miles from the shore on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Carthage was originally founded by a colony from this city of Tyre, and it soon became a great commercial and maritime power like its mother. The Carthaginians built ships, and with them explored all parts of the Mediterranean Sea. They visited all the nations on these coasts, purchased the commodities they had to sell, carried them to other nations, and sold them at great advances. They soon began to grow rich and powerful. They hired soldiers to fight their battles, and began to take possession of the islands of the Mediterranean, and, in some instances, of points on the mainland. For example, in Spain. Some of their ships going there found that the natives had silver and gold, which they obtained from veins of ore near the surface of the ground. At first, the Carthaginians obtained this gold and silver by selling the natives commodities of various kinds, which they had procured in other countries, paying, of course, to the producers only a very small price compared with what they required the Spaniards to pay them. Finally, they took possession of that part of Spain where the mines were situated, and worked the mines themselves. They dug deeper. They employed skillful engineers to make pumps and raise the water, which always accumulates in mines and prevents their being worked to any great depth unless the miners have a considerable degree of scientific and mechanical skill. They founded a city here which they called New Carthage, Nova Carthago. They fortified and garrisoned this city, and made it the center of their operations in Spain. This city is called Cartagena to this day. Thus the Carthaginians did everything by power of money. They extended their operations in every direction, each new extension bringing in new treasures, and increasing their means of extending them more. They had, besides the merchant vessels which belonged to private individuals, great ships of war belonging to the state. These vessels were called galleys, and were rowed by oarsmen, tier above tier, there being sometimes 4 and 5 banks of oars. They had armies too, drawn from different countries in various troops, according as different nations excelled in the different modes of warfare. For instance, the Numidians, whose country extended in the neighborhood of Carthage on the African coast, were famous for their horsemen. There were great plains in Numidia, and good grazing, and it was, consequently, one of those countries in which horses and horsemen naturally thrive. On the other hand, the natives of the Balearic Isles, now called Majorca, Minorca, and Ivica, were famous for their skill as slingers. So the Carthaginians, in making up their forces, would hire bodies of cavalry in Numidia and of slingers in the Balearic Isles, and for reasons analogous they got excellent infantry in Spain. The tendency of the various nations to adopt and cultivate different modes of warfare was far greater in those ancient times than now. The Balearic Isles, in fact, received their name from the Greek word balein, which means to throw with a sling. The youth were there trained to perfection in the use of this weapon from a very early age. It is said that mothers used to practice the plan of putting the bread for their boys' breakfast on the branches of trees high above their heads, and not allow them to have their food to eat until they could bring it down with a stone thrown from a sling. Thus the Carthaginian power became greatly extended. The whole government, however, was exercised by a small body of wealthy and aristocratic families at home. It was very much such a government as that of England is at the present day, only the aristocracy of England is based on ancient birth and landed property, whereas in Carthage it depended on commercial greatness, combined, it is true, with hereditary family distinction. The aristocracy of Carthage controlled and governed everything. None but its own sons could ordinarily obtain office or power. The great mass of inhabitants were kept in a state of servitude and vassalage. This state of things operated then, as it does now in England, very unjustly and hardly for those who were thus debased. But the result was, and in this respect the analogy with England still holds good, that a very efficient and energetic government was created. The government of an oligarchy makes sometimes a very rich and powerful state, but a discontented and unhappy people. Let the reader now turn to the map and find the place of Carthage upon it. Let him imagine a great and rich city there, with piers and docks and extensive warehouses for the commerce, and temples and public edifices of splendid architecture for the religious and civil service of the state, and elegant mansions and places for the wealthy aristocracy, and walls and towers for the defense of the whole. Let him imagine a back country extending for some 100 miles into the interior of Africa, fertile and highly cultivated, producing great stores of corn and wine and rich fruits of every description. Let him then look at the islands of Sicily, of Corsica, and Sardinia, and the Baleares, and conceive of them as rich and prosperous countries, and all under the Carthaginian rule. Look also at the coast of Spain. See, in imagination, the city of Cartagena, with its fortifications and its army and the gold and silver mines, with thousands and thousands of slaves toiling in them. Imagine fleets of ships going continually along the shores of the Mediterranean, from country to country, cruising back and forth to Tyre, to Cyprus, to Egypt, to Sicily, to Spain, carrying corn and flax and purple dyes and spices and perfumes and precious stones and ropes and sails for ships and gold and silver, and then periodically returning to Carthage to add the profits they had made to the vast treasures of wealth already accumulated there. Let the reader imagine all this with the map before him, so as to have a distinct conception of the geographical relations of the localities, and he will have a pretty correct idea of the Carthaginian power at the time it commenced its dreadful conflicts with Rome. Rome itself was very differently situated. Rome had been built by some wanderers from Troy, and it grew for a long time silently and slowly by a sort of internal principle of life and energy. One region after another of the Italian peninsula was merged in the Roman state. They formed a population which was, in the main, stationary and agricultural. They tilled the fields, they hunted the wild beasts, they raised great flocks and herds. They seem to have been a race, a sort of variety of the human species, possessed of a very refined and superior organization which, in its development, gave rise to a character of firmness, energy, and force, both of body and mind, which has justly excited the admiration of mankind. The Carthaginians had sagacity, the Romans called it cunning, and activity, enterprise, and wealth. Their rivals, on the other hand, were characterized by genius, courage, and strength, giving rise to a certain calm and indomitable resolution and energy, which has since, in every age, been strongly associated in the minds of men with the very word Roman. The progress of nations was much more slow in ancient days than now, and these two rival empires continued their gradual growth and extension, each on its own side of the great sea which divided them, for 500 years before they came into collision. At last, however, the collision came. It originated in the following way. By looking at the map, the reader will see that the island of Sicily is separated from the mainland by a narrow strait called the Strait of Messina. This strait derives its name from the town of Messina, which is situated upon it on the Sicilian side. Opposite Messina, on the Italian side, there was a town named Rhegium. Now it happened that both these towns had been taken possession of by lawless bodies of soldiery. The Romans came and delivered Rhegium, and punished the soldiers who had seized it very severely. The Sicilian authorities advanced to the deliverance of Messina. The troops there, finding themselves thus threatened, sent to the Romans to say that if they, the Romans, would come and protect them, they would deliver Messina into their hands. The question, what answer to give this application, was brought before the Roman Senate, and caused them great perplexity. It seemed very inconsistent to take sides with the rebels of Messina when they had punished so severely those of Rhegium. Still, the Romans had been, for a long time, becoming very jealous of the growth and extension of the Carthaginian power. Here was an opportunity of meeting and resisting it. The Sicilian authorities were about calling for direct aid from Carthage to recover the city, and the affair would probably result in establishing a large body of Carthaginian troops within sight of the Italian shore, and at a point where it would be easy for them to make hostile incursions into the Roman territories. In a word, it was a case of what is called political necessity, that is to say, a case in which the interests of one of the parties in a contest were so strong that all considerations of justice, consistency, and honor are to be sacrificed to the promotion of them. Instances of this kind of political necessity occur very frequently in the management of public affairs in all ages of the world. The contest for Messina was, after all, however, considered by the Romans merely as a pretext, or rather as an occasion, for commencing the struggle with which they had long been desirous of entering upon. They evinced their characteristic energy and greatness in the plan which they adopted at the outset. They knew very well that the power of Carthage rested mainly on her command of the seas, and that they could not hope successfully to cope with her till they could meet and conquer her on her own element. In the meantime, however, they had not a single ship and not a single sailor, while the Mediterranean was covered with Carthaginian ships and seamen. Not at all daunted by this prodigious inequality, the Romans resolved to begin at once the work of creating for themselves a naval power. The preparations consumed some time, for the Romans had not only to build the ships, they had first to learn how to build them. They took their first lesson from a Carthaginian galley which was cast away in a storm upon the coast of Italy. They seized this galley, collected their carpenters to examine it, and set woodmen to work to fell trees and collect materials for imitating it. The carpenters studied their model very carefully, measured the dimensions of every part, and observed the manner in which the various parts were connected and secured together. The heavy shocks which vessels are exposed to from the waves makes it necessary to secure great strength in the construction of them, and, though the ships of the ancients were very small and imperfect compared with the men of war of the present day, still it is surprising that the Romans could succeed at all in such a sudden and hasty attempt at building them. They did, however, succeed. While the ships were building, officers appointed for the purpose were training men on shore to the art of rowing them. Benches, like the seats which the oarsmen would occupy in the ships, were arranged on the ground, and the intended seamen were drilled every day in the movements and action of rowers. The result was that, in a few months after the building of the ships was commenced, the Romans had a fleet of 100 galleys of 5 banks of oars ready. They remained in harbor with them for some time to give the oarsmen the opportunity to see whether they could row on the water as well as on the land, and then boldly put to sea to meet the Carthaginians. There was one part of the arrangements made by the Romans in preparing their fleets which was strikingly characteristic of the determined resolution which marked all their conduct. They constructed machines containing grappling irons which they mounted on the prows of their vessels. These engines were so contrived that the moment one of the ships containing them encounter a vessel of the enemy, the grappling irons would fall upon the deck of the latter, and hold the two firmly together, so as to prevent the possibility of either escaping from the other. The idea that they themselves should have any wish to withdraw from the encounter seemed entirely out of the question. Their only fear was that the Carthaginian seamen would employ their superior skill and experience in naval maneuvers in making their escape. Mankind have always regarded the action of the Romans, in this case, as one of the most striking examples of military courage and resolution which the history of war has ever recorded. An army of landsmen come down to the seashore and, without scarcely having ever seen a ship, undertake to build a fleet and go out to attack a power whose navies covered the sea and made her the sole and acknowledged mistress of it. They seize a wrecked galley of their enemies for their model, they build 100 vessels like it, they practice maneuvers for a short time in port, and then go forth to meet the fleets of their powerful enemy with grappling machines to hold them, fearing nothing but the possibility of their escape. The result was as might have been expected. The Romans captured, sunk, destroyed, or dispersed the Carthaginian fleet which was brought to oppose them. They took the prows of the ships which they captured and conveyed them to Rome, and built what is called a rostral pillar of them. A rostral pillar is a column ornamented with such beaks or prows, which were, in the Roman language, called rostra. This column was nearly destroyed by lightning about 50 years afterward, but it was repaired and rebuilt again, and it stood then for many centuries, a very striking and appropriate monument of this extraordinary naval victory. The Roman commander in this case was the consul Duilius. The rostral column was erected in honor of him. In digging among the ruins of Rome, there was found what was supposed to be the remains of this column about 300 years ago. The Romans now prepared to carry the war into Africa itself. Of course it was easy, after their victory over the Carthaginian fleet, to transport troops across the sea to the Carthaginian shore. The Roman Commonwealth was governed at this time by a Senate, who made the laws, and by 2 supreme executive officers called consuls. They thought it was safer to have 2 chief magistrates than one, as each of the 2 would naturally be a check upon the other. The result was, however, that mutual jealousy involved them often in disputes and quarrels. It is thought better, in modern times, to have but one chief magistrate in the state, and to provide other modes to put a check upon any disposition he might evince to abuse his powers. The Roman consuls in time of war took command of the armies. The name of the consul upon whom it devolved to carry on the war with the Carthaginians, after this first great victory, was Regulus, and his name has been celebrated in every age on account of his extraordinary adventures in this campaign, and his untimely fate. How far the story is strictly true it is now impossible to ascertain, but the following is the story as the Roman historians relate it. At the time when Regulus was elected consul, he was a plain man, living simply on his farm, maintaining himself by his own industry, and evincing no ambition or pride. His fellow citizens, however, observed those qualities of mind in him which they were accustomed to admire, and made him consul. He left the city and took command of the army. he enlarged the fleet to more than 300 vessels. He put 140,000 men on board and sailed for Africa. 1 or 2 years had been spent in making these preparations, which time the Carthaginians had improved in building new ships, so that, when the Romans set sail and were moving along the coast of Sicily, they came in sight of a larger Carthaginian fleet assembled to oppose them. Regulus advanced to the contest. The Carthaginian fleet was beaten as before. The ships which were not captured or destroyed made their escape in all directions, and Regulus went on without further opposition and landed his forces on the Carthaginian shore. He encamped as soon as he landed and sent back word to the Roman Senate asking what was next to be done. The Senate, considering that the great difficulty and danger, viz., that of repulsing the Carthaginian fleet, was now past, ordered Regulus to send home nearly all the ships and a very large part of the army, and with the rest to commence his march toward Carthage. Regulus obeyed. He sent home the troops which had been ordered home, and with the rest began to advance upon the city. Just at this time, however, news came out to him that the farmer who had had the care of his land at home had died, and that his little farm, on which rested his sole reliance for the support of his family, was going to ruin. Regulus accordingly sent to the Senate, asking them to place someone else in command of the army, and allow him to resign his office, that he might go home and take care of his wife and children. The Senate sent back orders that he should go on with his campaign, and promised to provide support for his family, and to see that someone was appointed to take care of his land. This story is thought to illustrate the extreme simplicity and plainness of all the habits of life among the Romans in those days. It certainly does so, if it is true. It is, however, very extraordinary that a man who was entrusted by such a commonwealth with the command of a fleet of 130 vessels and an army of 140,000 men should have a family at home dependent for subsistence on the hired cultivation of 7 acres of land. Still, such is the story. Regulus advanced toward Carthage, conquering as he came. The Carthaginians were beaten in one field after another, and were reduced, in fact, to the last extremity, when an occurrence took place which turned the scale. This was the arrival of a large body of troops from Greece, with a Grecian general at their head. These were troops which the Carthaginians had hired to fight for them, as was the case with the rest of the army. But these were Greeks, and the Greeks were of the same race and possessed the same qualities as the Romans. The newly arrived Grecian general evinced at once such military superiority that the Carthaginians gave him the supreme command. He marshaled the army accordingly for battle. He had 100 elephants in the van. They were trained to rush forward and trample down the enemy. He had the Greek phalanx in the center, which was a close, compact body of many thousand troops, bristling with long iron-pointed spears, with which the men pressed forward, bearing everything before them. Regulus was, in a word, ready to meet Carthaginians, but he was not prepared to encounter Greeks. His army was put to flight, and he was taken prisoner. Nothing could exceed the excitement and exultation in the city when they saw Regulus and 500 other Roman soldiers brought captive in. A few days before they had been in consternation at the imminent danger of his coming in as a ruthless and vindictive conqueror. The Roman Senate were not discouraged by this disaster. They fitted out new armies, and the war went on, Regulus being kept all the time at Carthage as a close prisoner. At last the Carthaginians authorized him to go to Rome as a sort of commissioner, to propose to the Romans to exchange prisoners and make peace. They extracted from him a solemn promise that if he was unsuccessful he would return. The Romans had taken many of the Carthaginians prisoners in their naval combats and held them captive at Rome. It is customary in such cases for the belligerent nations to make an exchange and restore the captives on both sides to their friends and home. It was such an exchange of prisoners as this which Regulus was to propose. When Regulus reached Rome, he refused to enter the city, but he appeared before the Senate without the walls, in a very humble garb, and with the most subdued and unassuming demeanor. He was no longer, he said, a Roman officer or even citizen, but a Carthaginian prisoner, and he disavowed all right to direct or even to counsel the Roman authorities in respect to the proper course to be pursued. His opinion was, however, he said, that the Romans ought not to make peace or exchange prisoners. He himself and the other Roman prisoners were old and infirm and not worth the exchange, and, moreover, they had no claim whatsoever on their country, as they could only have been made prisoners in consequence of want of courage or patriotism to die in their country's cause. He said that the Carthaginians were tired of the war, and that their resources were exhausted, and that the Romans ought to press forward in it with renewed vigor, and leave himself and the other prisoners to their fate. The Senate came very slowly and reluctantly to the conclusion to follow this advice. They, however, all earnestly joined in attempting to persuade Regulus that he was under no obligation to return to Carthage. His promise, they said, was extorted by the circumstances of the case, and was not binding. Regulus, however, insisted on keeping his faith with his enemies. He sternly refused to see his family, and, bidding the Senate farewell, he returned to Carthage. The Carthaginians, exasperated at his having interposed himself to prevent the succession of his mission, tortured him for some time in the most cruel manner, and finally put him to death. One would think that he ought to have counseled peace and an exchange of prisoners, and he ought not to have refused to see his unhappy wife and children, but it was certainly very noble of him to refuse to break his word. The war continued for some time after this, until, at length, both nations became weary of the contest, and peace was made. The following is the treaty which was signed. It shows that the advantage on the whole in this first Punic War was on the part of the Romans. There shall be peace between Rome and Carthage. The Carthaginians shall evacuate all Sicily. They shall not make war upon any allies of the Romans. They shall restore to the Romans without ransom all the prisoners which they have taken from them, and pay them within 10 years 3,200 talents of silver. The war had continued for 24 years. End of chapter 1. Recording by Hollis, Hanover.
Chapter 2 of Hannibal. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Haley Flagg. Hannibal by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 2. Hannibal at Saguntum. The name of Hannibal's father was Hamilcar. He was one of the leading Carthaginian generals. He occupied a very prominent position, both on account of his rank and wealth and high family connections at Carthage, and also on account of the great military energy which he displayed in the command of the armies abroad. He carried on the wars which the Carthaginians waged in Africa and in Spain after the conclusion of the war with the Romans, and he longed to commence hostilities with the Romans again. At one time, when Hannibal was about 9 years of age, Hamilcar was preparing to set off on an expedition into Spain, and, as was usual in those days, he was celebrating the occasion with games and spectacles and various religious ceremonies. It has been the custom in all ages of the world, when nations go to war with each other, for each side to take measures for propitiating the favor of heaven. Christian nations at the present day do it by prayers offered in each country for the success of their own arms. Heathen nations do it by sacrifices, libations, and offerings. Hamilcar had made arrangements for such sacrifices, and the priests were offering them in the presence of the whole assembled army. Young Hannibal, then about 9 years of age, was present. He was a boy of great spirit and energy, and he entered with much enthusiasm into the scene. He wanted to go to Spain himself with the army, and he came to his father and began to urge his request. His father could not consent to this. He was too young to endure the privations and fatigues of such an enterprise. However, his father brought him to one of the altars in the presence of the other officers of the army, and made him lay his hands on the consecrated victim, and swear that, as soon as he was old enough, and had it in his power, he would make war upon the Romans. This was done, no doubt, in part to amuse young Hannibal's mind, and to relieve his disappointment in not being able to go to war at the time, by promising him a great and mighty enemy to fight at some future day. Hannibal remembered it, and longed for the time to come when he could go to war against the Romans. Hamilcar bade his son farewell, and embarked for Spain. He was at liberty to extend his conquest there in all directions west of the river Iberus, a river which the reader will find upon the map, flowing southeast into the Mediterranean Sea. Its name, Iberus, has been gradually changed, in modern times, to Ebro. By the treaty with the Romans, the Carthaginians were not to cross the Iberus. They were also bound by the treaty not to molest the people of Saguntum, a city lying between Iberus and the Carthaginian dominions. Saguntum was in alliance with the Romans and under their protection. Hamilcar was, however, very restless and uneasy at being obliged thus to refrain from hostilities with the Roman power. He began, immediately after his arrival in Spain, to form plans for renewing the war. He had under him, as his principal lieutenant, a young man who had married his daughter. His name was Hasdrubal. With Hasdrubal's aid, he went on extending his conquests in Spain, and strengthening his position there, and gradually maturing his plans for renewing war with the Romans, when at length he died. Hasdrubal succeeded him. Hannibal was now, probably, about 21 or 2 years old, and still in Carthage. Hasdrubal sent to the Carthaginian government a request that Hannibal might receive an appointment in the army, and be sent out to join him in Spain. On the subject of complying with this request, there was a great debate in the Carthaginian Senate. In all cases where questions of government were controlled by votes, it had been found in every age that parties will always be formed, of which the two most prominent will usually be nearly balanced one against the other. Thus, at this time, though the Hamilcar family were in power, there was a very strong party in Carthage in opposition to them. The leader of this party in the Senate, whose name was Hanno, made a very earnest speech against sending Hannibal. He was too young, he said, to be of any service. He would only learn the vices and follies of the camp, and thus become corrupted and ruined. Besides, said Hanno, at this rate, the command of our armies in Spain is getting to be a sort of hereditary right. Hamilcar was not a king, that his authority should thus descend first to his son-in-law, and then to his son. For this plan of making Hannibal, he said, while yet scarcely arrived at manhood, a high officer in the army, is only a stepping stone to the putting of the forces wholly under his orders, whenever, for any reason, Hasdrubal shall cease to command them. The Roman historian, through whose narrative we get our only account of this debate, says that, though these were good reasons, yet strength prevailed, as usual, over wisdom, in the decision of the question. They voted to send Hannibal, and he set out to cross the sea to Spain with a heart full of enthusiasm and joy. A great deal of curiosity and interest was felt throughout the army to see him on his arrival. The soldiers had been devotedly attached to his father, and they were all ready to transfer this attachment at once to the son, if he should prove worthy of it. It was very evident, soon after he reached the camp, that he was going to prove himself thus worthy. He entered at once into the duties of his position with a degree of energy, patience, and self-denial which attracted universal attention, and made him a universal favourite. He dressed plainly, he assumed no airs, he sought for no pleasures or indulgences, nor demanded any exemption from the dangers and privations which the common soldiers had to endure. He ate plain food, and slept, often, in his military cloak, on the ground, in the midst of the soldiers on guard, and in battle he was always foremost to press forward into the contest, and the last to leave the ground when the time came for repose. The Romans say that, in addition to these qualities, he was inhuman and merciless when in open warfare with his foes, and cunning and treacherous in every other mode of dealing with them. It is very probable that he was so. Such traits of character were considered by soldiers in those days, as they are now, virtues in themselves, though vices in their enemies. However this may be, Hannibal became a great and universal favourite in the army. He went on for several years increasing his military knowledge, and widening and extending his influence, when at length, one day, Hasdrubal was suddenly killed by a ferocious native of the country, whom he had by some means offended. As soon as the first shock of this occurrence was over, the leaders of the army went in pursuit of Hannibal, whom they brought in triumph to the tent of Hasdrubal, and instated him at once in the supreme command, with one consent and in the midst of universal acclamations. As soon as news of this event reached Carthage, the government there confirmed the act of the army, and Hannibal thus found himself suddenly but securely invested with a very high military command. His eager and restless desire to try his strength with the Romans received a new impulse by his finding that the power was now in his hands. Still the two countries were at peace. They were bound by solemn treaties to continue so. The river Iberus was the boundary which separated the dominions of the two nations from each other in Spain, the territory east of that boundary being under the Roman power, and that on the west under that of the Carthaginians. Except that Saguntum, which was on the western side, was an ally of the Romans, and the Carthaginians were bound by the treaty to leave it independent and free. Hannibal could not, therefore, cross the Iberus or attack Saguntum without an open infraction of the treaty. He, however, immediately began to move towards Saguntum, and to attack the nations in the immediate vicinity of it. If he wished to get into a war with the Romans, this was the proper way to promote it, for by advancing thus into the immediate vicinity of the capital of their allies, there was great probability that disputes would arise which would sooner or later end in war. The Romans say that Hannibal was cunning and treacherous, and he certainly did display, on some occasions, a great degree of adroitness in his stratagems. In one instance in these preliminary wars he gained a victory over an immensely superior force in a very remarkable manner. He was returning from an inroad upon some of the northern provinces, laden and encumbered with spoil, when he learned that an immense army, consisting, it was said, of 100,000 men, were coming down upon his rear. There was a river at a short distance before him. Hannibal pressed on and crossed the river by a ford, the water being perhaps about 3 feet deep. He secreted a large body of cavalry near the bank of the stream, and pushed on with the main body of the army to some little distance from the river, so as to produce the impression upon his pursuers that he was pressing forward to make his escape. The enemy, thinking that they had no time to lose, poured down in great numbers into the stream from various points along the bank, and as soon as they had reached the middle of the current and were wading laboriously, half submerged, with their weapons held above their heads, so as to present as little resistance as possible to the water, the horsemen of Hannibal rushed in to meet and attack them. The horsemen had, of course, greatly the advantage, for though their horses were in the water, they were themselves raised above it, and their limbs were free, while their enemies were half submerged, and being encumbered by their arms and by one another, were nearly helpless. They were immediately thrown into complete confusion, and were overwhelmed and carried down by the current in great numbers. Some of them succeeded in landing below, on Hannibal's side, but in the meantime the main body of his army had returned, and was ready to receive them, and they were trampled under foot by the elephants, which it was the custom to employ, in those days, as a military force. As soon as the river was cleared, Hannibal marched his own army across it, and attacked what remained of the enemy on their own side. He gained a complete victory, which was so great and decisive, that he secured by it possession of the whole country west of the Iberus, except Saguntum, and Saguntum itself began to be seriously alarmed. The Saguntines sent ambassadors to Rome to ask the Romans to interpose and protect them from the dangers which threatened them. These ambassadors made diligent efforts to reach Rome as soon as possible, but they were too late. On some pretext or other, Hannibal contrived to raise a dispute between the city and one of the neighbouring tribes, and then, taking sides with the tribe, he advanced to attack the city. The Saguntines prepared for their defence, hoping soon to receive succours from Rome. They strengthened and fortified their walls, while Hannibal began to move forward great military engines for battering them down. Hannibal knew very well that by his hostilities against this city he was commencing a contest with Rome itself, as Rome must necessarily take part with her ally. In fact, there is no doubt that his design was to bring on a general war between the two great nations. He began with Saguntum for 2 reasons. First, it would not be safe for him to cross the Iberus and advance into the Roman territory, leaving so wealthy and powerful a city in his rear. And then, in the second place, it was easier for him to find pretext for getting indirectly into a quarrel with Saguntum, and throwing the odium of a declaration of war on Rome, than to persuade the Carthaginian state to renounce the peace and themselves commence hostilities. There was, as has been already stated, a very strong party at Carthage opposed to Hannibal, who would of course resist any measures tending to a war with Rome, for they would consider such a war as opening a vast field for gratifying Hannibal's ambition. The only way, therefore, was to provoke a war by aggressions on the Roman allies, to be justified by the best pretext he could find. Saguntum was a very wealthy and powerful city. It was situated about a mile from the sea. The attack upon the place, and the defence of it by the inhabitants, went on for some time with great vigour. In these operations Hannibal exposed himself to great danger. He approached at one time so near the wall, in superintending the arrangements of his soldiers and the planting of his engines, that a heavy javelin, thrown from the parapet, struck him on the thigh. It pierced the flesh and inflicted so severe a wound that he fell immediately, and was borne away by the soldiers. It was several days before he was free from the danger incurred by the loss of blood and the fever which follows such a wound. During all this time his army was in a great state of excitement and anxiety, and suspended their active operations. As soon, however, as Hannibal was found to be decidedly convalescent, they resumed them again, and urged them onward with greater energy than before. The weapons of warfare in those ancient days were entirely different from those which are now employed, and there was one described by an ancient historian as used by the Saguntines at this siege, which might almost come under the modern denomination of firearms. It was called the philarica. It was a sort of javelin, consisting of a shaft of wood with a long point of iron. This point was said to be 3 feet long. This javelin was to be thrown at the enemy either from the hand of the soldier or by an engine. The leading peculiarity of it was, however, that, near to the pointed end, there were wound around the wooden shaft long bands of tow, which were saturated with pitch and other combustibles, and this inflammable band was set on fire just before the javelin was thrown. As the missile flew on its way, the wind fanned the flames and made them burn so fiercely that when the javelin struck the shield of the soldier opposing it, it could not be pulled out, and the shield itself had to be thrown down and abandoned. While the inhabitants of Saguntum were vainly endeavouring to defend themselves against their terrible enemy by these and similar means, their ambassadors, not knowing that their city had been attacked, had reached Rome, and had laid before the Roman Senate their fears that the city would be attacked unless they adopted vigorous and immediate measures to prevent it. The Romans resolved to send ambassadors to Hannibal to demand of him what his intentions were, and to warn him against any acts of hostility against Saguntum. When these Roman ambassadors arrived on the coast near to Saguntum, they found that hostilities had commenced, and the city was hotly besieged. They were at a loss to know what to do. It is better for a rebel not to hear an order which he is determined beforehand not to obey. Hannibal, with an adroitness which the Carthaginians called sagacity, and the Romans treachery and cunning, determined not to see these messengers. He sent word to them at the shore that they must not attempt to come to his camp, for the country was in such a disturbed condition that it would not be safe for them to land. And besides, he could not receive or attend to them, for he was too much pressed with the urgency of his military works to have any time to spare for debates and negotiations. Hannibal knew that the ambassadors, being thus repulsed, and having found, too, that the war had broken out, and that Saguntum was actually beset and besieged by Hannibal's armies, would proceed immediately to Carthage to demand satisfaction there. He knew also that Hanno and his party would very probably espouse the cause for the Romans, and endeavour to arrest his designs. He accordingly sent his own ambassadors to Carthage, to exert an influence in his favour in the Carthaginian Senate, and endeavour to urge them to reject the claims of the Romans, and allow the war between Rome and Carthage to break out again. The Roman ambassadors appeared at Carthage, and were admitted to an audience before the Senate. They stated their case, representing that Hannibal had made war upon Saguntum in violation of the treaty, and had refused even to receive the communication which had been sent him by the Roman Senate through them. They demanded that the Carthaginian government should disavow his acts, and deliver him up to them, in order that he might receive the punishment which his violation of the treaty and his aggressions upon an ally of the Romans so justly deserved. The party of Hannibal in the Carthaginian Senate was, of course, earnest to have these proposals rejected with scorn. The other side, with Hanno at their head, maintained that they were reasonable demands. Hanno, in a very energetic and powerful speech, told the Senate that he had warned them not to send Hannibal into Spain. He had foreseen that such a hot and turbulent spirit as his would involve them in inextricable difficulties with the Roman power. Hannibal had, he said, plainly violated the treaty. He had invested and besieged Saguntum, which they were solemnly bound not to molest, and they had nothing to expect in return but that the Roman legions would soon be investing and besieging their own city. In the meantime, the Romans, he added, had been moderate and forbearing. They had brought nothing to the charge of the Carthaginians. They accused nobody but Hannibal, who, thus far, alone was guilty. The Carthaginians, by disavowing his acts, could save themselves from the responsibility of them. He urged, therefore, that an embassage of apology should be sent to Rome, that Hannibal should be deposed and delivered up to the Romans, and that ample restitution should be made to the Saguntines for the injuries they had received. On the other hand, the friends of Hannibal urged in the Carthaginian Senate their defence of the general. They reviewed the history of the transactions in which the war had originated, and showed, or attempted to show, that the Saguntines themselves commenced hostilities, and that consequently they, and not Hannibal, were responsible for all that followed. That under those circumstances the Romans ought not to take their part, and if they did so it proved that they preferred the friendship of Saguntum to that of Carthage, and that it would be cowardly and dishonourable in the extreme for them to deliver the general whom they had placed in power, and who had shown himself so worthy of their choice by his courage and energy, into the hands of their ancient and implacable foes. Thus Hannibal was waging at the same time 2 wars, one in the Carthaginian Senate, where the weapons were arguments and eloquence, and the other under the walls of Saguntum, which was fought with battering rams and fiery javelins. He conquered in both. The Senate decided to send the Roman ambassadors home without acceding to their demands, and the walls of Saguntum were battered down by Hannibal's engines. The inhabitants refused all terms of compromise and resisted to the last, so that, when the victorious soldiery broke over the prostrate walls and poured into the city, it was given up to them to plunder, and they killed and destroyed all that came in their way. The disappointed ambassadors returned to Rome with the news that Saguntum had been taken and destroyed by Hannibal, and that the Carthaginians, far from offering any satisfaction for the wrong, assumed the responsibility of it themselves, and were preparing for war. Thus Hannibal accomplished his purpose of opening the way for waging war against the Roman power. He prepared to enter into the contest with the utmost energy and zeal. The conflict that ensued lasted 17 years, and is known in history as the Second Punic War. It was one of the most dreadful struggles between rival and hostile nations which the gloomy history of mankind exhibits to view. The events that occurred will be described in the subsequent chapters. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Haley Flagg of Texas.
Chapter 3 of Hannibal. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sławek Księżycki. Hannibal by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 3. Opening of the Second Punic War. When the tide once turns in any nation in favor of war, it generally rushes on with great impetuosity and force, and bears all before it. It was so in Carthage in this instance. The party of Hanno were thrown entirely into the minority and silenced, and the friends and partisans of Hannibal carried not only the government but the whole community with them, and everybody was eager for war. This was owing, in part, to the natural contagiousness of the martial spirit which, when felt by one, catches easily by sympathy in the heart of another. It is a fire which, when once it begins to burn, spreads in every direction and consumes all that comes in its way. Besides, when Hannibal gained possession of Saguntum, he found immense treasures there, which he employed not to increase his own private fortune, but to strengthen and confirm his civil and military power. The Saguntines did everything they could to prevent these treasures from falling into his hands. They fought desperately to the last, refused all terms of surrender, and they became so insanely desperate in the end that, according to the narrative of Livy, when they found that the walls and towers of the city were falling in, and that all hope of further defense was gone, they built an enormous fire in the public streets and heaped upon it all the treasures which they had time to collect, that fire could destroy, and then that many of the principal inhabitants leaped into the flames themselves, in order that their hated conquerors might lose their prisoners as well as their spoils. Notwithstanding this, however, Hannibal obtained a vast amount of gold and silver, both in the form of money and of plate, and also much valuable merchandise, which the Saguntine merchants had accumulated in their palaces and warehouses. He used all this property to strengthen his own political and military position. He paid his soldiers all the arrears due to them in full. He divided among them a large additional amount as their share of the spoil. He sent rich trophies home to Carthage, and presents consisting of sums of money and jewelry and gems to his friends here and to those whom he wished to make his friends. The result of this munificence and of the renown which his victories in Spain had procured for him was to raise him to the highest pinnacle of influence and honor. The Carthaginians chose him one of the Sophetes. The Sophetes were the supreme executive officers of the Carthaginian Commonwealth. The government was, as has been remarked before, a sort of aristocratic republic, and republics are always very cautious about entrusting power, even executive power, to any one man. As Rome had two consuls reigning jointly, and France, after her first revolution, a directory of 5, so the Carthaginians chose annually 2 Sophetes, as they were called at Carthage, though the Roman writers call them indiscriminately Sophetes, consuls, and kings. So that, in conjunction with his colleague, he held the supreme civil authority in Carthage, besides being invested with the command of the vast and victorious army in Spain. When news of these events, the siege and destruction of Saguntum, the rejection of the demands of the Roman ambassadors, and the vigorous preparations making by the Carthaginians for war, reached Rome, the whole city was thrown into consternation. The Senate and the people held tumultuous and disorderly assemblies, in which the events which had occurred and the course of proceeding which it was incumbent on the Romans to take were discussed with much excitement and clamor. The Romans were, in fact, afraid of the Carthaginians. The campaigns of Hannibal in Spain had impressed the people with a strong sense of remorseless and terrible energy of his character. They at once concluded that his plans would be formed for marching into Italy, and they even anticipated the danger of his bringing the war up to the very gates of the city, so as to threaten them with the destruction which he had brought upon Saguntum. The event showed how justly they appreciated his character. Since the conclusion of the First Punic War, there had been peace between the Romans and Carthaginians for about a quarter of a century. During all this time both nations had been advancing in wealth and power, but the Carthaginians had made much more rapid progress than the Romans. The Romans had indeed been very successful at the outset in the former war, but in the end the Carthaginians had proved themselves their equal. They seemed therefore to dread now a fresh encounter with these powerful foes, led on as they were now to be by such a commander as Hannibal. They determined therefore to send a second embassy to Carthage with a view of making one more effort to preserve peace before actually commencing hostilities. They accordingly selected 5 men from among the most influential citizens of the state, men of venerable age and of great public consideration, and commissioned them to proceed to Carthage and ask once more whether it was the deliberate and final decision of the Carthaginian Senate to avow and sustain the action of Hannibal. This solemn embassage set sail. They arrived at Carthage, they appeared before the Senate, they argued their cause, but it was of course to deaf and unwilling ears. The Carthaginian orators replied to them, each side attempting to throw the blame of the violation of the treaty on the other. It was a solemn hour for the peace of the world, the lives of hundreds of thousands of men, and the continued happiness or the desolation and ruin of vast regions of country dependent on the issue of the debate. Unhappily, the bridge was only widened by the discussion. "Very well," said the Roman commissioners at last, "we offer you peace or war. Which do you choose?" "Whichever you please," replied the Carthaginians. "Decide for yourselves." "War, then," said the Romans, "since it must be so." The conference was broken up, and the ambassadors returned to Rome. They returned, however, by the way of Spain. Their object in doing this was to negotiate with the various kingdoms and tribes in Spain and in France, through which Hannibal would have to march in invading Italy, and endeavor to induce them to take sides with the Romans. They were too late, however, for Hannibal had contrived to extend and establish his influence in all that region too strongly to be shaken, so that on one pretext or another the Roman proposals were all rejected. There was one powerful tribe, for example, called the Volscians. The ambassadors, in the presence of the great council of the Volscians, made known to them the probability of war, and invited them to ally themselves with the Romans. The Volscians rejected the proposition with a sort of scorn. "We see," said they, "from the fate of Saguntum, what is to be expected to result from an alliance with the Romans. After leaving that city defenseless and alone in its struggle against such terrible danger, it is in vain to ask other nations to trust to your protection. If you wish for new allies, it will be best for you to go where the story of Saguntum is not known." This answer of the Volscians was applauded by the other nations of Spain, as far as it was known, and the Roman ambassadors, despairing of success in that country, went on into Gaul, which is the name by which the country now called France is known in ancient history. On reaching a certain place, which was a certain point of influence and power in Gaul, the Roman commissioners convened a great martial council there. The spectacle presented by this assembly was very imposing, for the warlike councillors came to the meeting armed completely and in the most formidable manner, as if they were coming to a battle instead of a consultation and debate. The venerable ambassadors laid the subject before them. They descended largely on the power and greatness of the Romans, and on the certainty that they should conquer in the approaching contest, and they invited the Gauls to espouse their cause and to rise in arms and intercept Hannibal's passage through their country if he should attempt to effect one. The assembly could hardly be induced to hear the ambassadors through, and as soon as they had finished their address, the whole council broke forth into cries of dissent and displeasure, and even into shouts of derision. Order was at length restored, and the officers whose duty it was to express the sentiments of the assembly gave forth their reply that the Gauls had never received anything but violence and injuries from Rome, or anything but kindness and goodwill from Carthage, and that they had no idea of being guilty of the folly of bringing the impending storm of Hannibal's hostility upon their own heads, merely for the sake of averting it from their ancient and implacable foes. Thus the ambassadors were everywhere repulsed. They found no friendly disposition toward the Roman power till they had crossed the Rhone. Hannibal began now to form his plans in a very deliberate and cautious manner for a march into Italy. He knew very well that this was an expedition of such magnitude and duration as to require beforehand the most careful and well-considered arrangements, both for the forces which were to go and for the states and communities which were to remain. The winter was coming on. His first measure was to dismiss a large portion of his forces that they might visit their homes. He told them that he was intending some great designs for the ensuing spring, which might take them to a great distance and keep them for a long time absent from Spain, and he would accordingly give them the intervening time to visit their families and their homes and to arrange their affairs. This act of kind consideration and confidence renewed the attachment of the soldiers to their commander, and they returned to his camp in the spring not only with new strength and vigor, but with redoubled attachment to the service in which they were engaged. Hannibal, after sending home his soldiers, retired himself to New Carthage, which, as will be seen by the map, is further west than Saguntum, where he went into winter quarters and devoted himself to the maturing of his designs. Besides the necessary preparations for his own march, he had to provide for the government of the countries that he should leave. He devised various and ingenious plans to prevent the danger of insurrections and rebellions while he was gone. One was to organize an army for Spain out of soldiers drawn from Africa, while the troops which were to be employed to garrison Carthage and to sustain the government there were taken from Spain. By thus changing the troops of the two countries, each country was controlled by a foreign soldiery who were more likely to be faithful in their obedience to their commanders, and less in danger of sympathizing with the populations which they were respectively employed to control, than if each had been retained in its own native land. Hannibal knew very well that the various states and provinces of Spain which had refused to ally themselves with the Romans and abandon him had been led to do this through the influence of his presence or the fear of his power, and that if, after he had penetrated into Italy, he should meet with reverses, so as to diminish very much their hope of deriving benefit from his favour, or their fear of his power, there would be great danger of defections and revolts. As an additional security against this, he adopted the following ingenious plan. He enlisted a body of troops from among all the nations of Spain that were in alliance with him, selecting the young men who were enlisted as much as possible from families of consideration and influence, and this body of troops, when organized and officered, he sent into Carthage, giving the nations and tribes from which they were drawn to understand that he considered them not only as soldiers serving in his armies, but as hostages, which he should hold as security for the fidelity and obedience of the countries from which they had come. The number of these soldiers was 4,000. Hannibal had a brother, whose name, as it happened, was the same as that of his brother-in-law, Hasdrubal. It was to him that he committed the government of Spain during his absence. The soldiers provided for him were, as has been already stated, mainly drawn from Africa. In addition to the foot soldiers, he provided him with a small body of horse. He left with him also 14 elephants, and as he thought it not improbable that the Romans might, in some contingency, during his absence, make a descent upon the Spanish coast from the sea, he built and equipped for him a small fleet of about 60 vessels, 50 of which were of the first class. In modern times, the magnitude and efficiency of a ship is estimated by the number of guns she will carry. Then it was the number of banks of oars. 50 of Hasdrubal's ships were kinkerems, as they were called, that is, they had 5 banks of oars. The Romans, on the other hand, did not neglect their own preparations. Though reluctant to enter upon the war, they still prepared to engage in it with their characteristic energy and ardor, when they found that it could not be averted. They resolved on raising 2 powerful armies, one for each of the consuls. The plan was, with one of these to advance to meet Hannibal, and with the other to proceed to Sicily, and from Sicily to the African coast, with a view of threatening the Carthaginian capital. This plan, if successful, would compel the Carthaginians to recall a part or the whole of Hannibal's army from the intended invasion of Italy to defend their own African homes. The force raised by the Romans amounted to about 70,000 men. About a third of these were Roman soldiers, and the remainder were drawn from various nations dwelling in Italy and in the islands of the Mediterranean Sea, which were in alliance with the Romans. Of these troops 6,000 were cavalry. Of course, as the Romans intended to cross into Africa, they needed a fleet. They built and equipped one, which consisted of 220 ships of the largest class, that is, kinkerems, besides a number of smaller and lighter vessels for services requiring speed. There were vessels in use in those times larger than the kinkerems. Mention is occasionally made of those which had 6 and even 7 banks of oars, but these were only employed as the flagships of commanders and for other purposes of ceremony and parade, as they were too unwieldy for efficient service in action. Lots were then drawn in a very solemn manner, according to the Roman custom of such occasions, to decide on the assignment of these 2 armies to the respective consuls. The one destined to meet Hannibal on his way from Spain fell to a consul named Cornelius Sippo. The name of the other was Sempronius. It devolved on him consequently to take charge of the expedition destined to Sicily and Africa. When all the arrangements were thus made, the question was finally put in a very solemn and formal manner to the Roman people for their final vote and decision. Do the Roman people decide and decree that war shall be declared against the Carthaginians? The decision was in the affirmative. The war was then proclaimed with the usual imposing ceremonies. Sacrifices and religious celebrations followed to propitiate the favor of the gods, and to inspire the soldiers with that kind of courage and confidence which the superstitious, however wicked, feel when they can imagine themselves under the protection of heaven. These shows and spectacles being over, all things were ready. In the meantime Hannibal was moving on, as the spring advanced, toward the banks of Iberus, that frontier stream, the crossing of which made him an invader of what was in some sense Roman territory. He boldly passed the stream and moved forward along the coast of the Mediterranean, gradually approaching the Pyrenees, which formed the boundary between France and Spain. His soldiers hitherto did not know what his plans were. It is very little the custom now for military and naval commanders to communicate to their men much information about their designs, and it was still less the custom then. And besides, in those days the common soldiers had no access to those means of information by which news of every sort is now so universally diffused. Thus, though all the officers of the army and well-informed citizens both in Rome and Carthage anticipated and understood Hannibal's designs, his own soldiers, ignorant and degraded, knew nothing except that they were to go on some distant and dangerous service. They very likely had no idea whatever of Italy or of Rome, or of the magnitude of the possessions, or of the power held by the vast empire which they were going to invade. When, however, after travelling day after day, they came to the foot of the Pyrenees and found that they were really going to pass that mighty chain of mountains, and for this purpose were actually entering its wild and gloomy defiles, the courage of some of them failed, and they began to murmur. The discontent and alarm were in fact so great that one corps, consisting of about 3,000 men, left the camp in a body and moved back toward their homes. On inquiry, Hannibal found that there were 10,000 more who were in a similar state of feeling. His whole force consisted of over 100,000, and now what does the reader imagine that Hannibal would do in such an emergency? Would he return in pursuit of these deserters to recapture and destroy them as a terror to the rest? Or would he let them go and attempt by words of conciliation and encouragement to confirm and save those that yet remained? He did neither. He called together the 10,000 discontented troops that were still in his camp and told them that, since they were afraid to accompany his army, or unwilling to do so, they might return. He wanted none in his service who had not the courage and fortitude to go on wherever he might lead. He would not have the faint-hearted and the timid in his army. They would only be a burden to load down and impede the courage and energy of the rest. So saying, he gave orders for them to return, and with the rest of the army, whose resolution and ardor were redoubled by this occurrence, he moved on through the passes of the mountains. This act of Hannibal, in permitting his discontented soldiers to return, had all the effect of a deed of generosity in its influence upon the minds of the soldiers who went on. We must not, however, imagine that it was prompted by a spirit of generosity at all. It was policy. A seeming generosity was, in this case, exactly what was wanted to answer his ends. Hannibal was mercilessly cruel in all cases where he imagined that severity was demanded. It requires great sagacity sometimes in a commander to know when he must punish and when it is wisest to overlook and forgive. Hannibal, like Alexander and Napoleon, possessed this sagacity in a very high degree, and it was doubtless the exercise of that principle alone which prompted his action on this occasion. Thus Hannibal passed the Pyrenees. The next difficulty that he anticipated was in crossing the river Rhone. End of chapter 3. Recording by Sławek Księżycki. Chapter 4 of Hannibal. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sławek Księżycki. Hannibal by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 4. The Passage of the Rhone. Hannibal, after he had passed the Pyrenees, did not anticipate any new difficulty till he should arrive at the Rhone. He knew very well that that was a broad and rapid river, and that he must cross it near its mouth, where the water was deep and the banks low. And besides, it was not impossible that the Romans who were coming to meet him under Cornelius Sippo might have reached the Rhone before he should arrive there and be ready upon the banks to dispute his passage. He had sent forward, therefore, a small detachment in advance to reconnoitre the country and select a route to the Rhone, and if they met with no difficulties to arrest them there, they were to go on till they reached the Alps, and explore the passages and defiles through which his army could best cross those snow-covered mountains. It seems that before they reached the Pyrenees, that is, while he was upon the Spanish side of them, some of the tribes through whose territories he had to pass undertook to resist him, and he consequently had to attack them and reduce them by force. And then, when he was ready to move on, he left a guard in the territories thus conquered to keep them in subjection. Rumors of this reached Gaul. The Gauls were alarmed for their own safety. They had not intended to oppose Hannibal so long as they supposed that he only wished for a safe passage through their country on his way to Italy, but now, when they found from what had occurred in Spain that he was going to conquer the countries he traversed as he passed along, they became alarmed. They seized their arms and assembled in haste at Ruscino, and began to devise measures of defence. Ruscino was the same place as that in which the Roman ambassadors met the great council of the Gauls on their return to Italy from Carthage. While this great council, or rather assembly of armies, was gathering at Ruscino, full of threats and anger, Hannibal was at Illiberis, a town at the foot of the Pyrenean mountains. He seems to have had no fear that any opposition which the Gauls could bring to bear against him would be successful, but he dreaded the delay. He was extremely unwilling to spend the precious months of the early summer in contending with such foes as they, when the road to Italy was before him. Besides, the passes of the Alps, which are difficult and laborious at any time, are utterly impracticable except in the months of July and August. At all other seasons they are, or were in those days, blocked up with impassable snows. In modern times roads have been made, with galleries cut through the rock, and with the exposed places protected by sloping roofs projecting from above, over which storms sweep and avalanches slide without injury. So that now the intercourse of ordinary travel between France and Italy across the Alps is kept in some measure all the year. In Hannibal's time, however, the mountains could not be traversed except in the summer months, and if it had not been that the result justified the undertaking, it would have been considered an act of inexcusable rashness and folly to attempt to cross with an army at all. Hannibal had therefore no time to lose, and that circumstance made this case one of those in which forbearance and a show of generosity were called for instead of defiance and force. He accordingly sent messengers to the council at Ruscino to say, in a very complaisant and affable manner, that he wished to see and confer with their princes in person, and that, if they pleased, he would advance for this purpose toward Ruscino, or they might, if they preferred, come on toward him at Illiberis, where he would await their arrival. He invited them to come freely into his camp, and said that he was ready, if they were willing to receive him, to go into theirs, for he had come to Gaul as a friend and an ally, and wanted nothing but a free passage through their territory. He had made a resolution, he said, if the Gauls would but allow him to keep it, that there should not be a single sword drawn in his army till he got into Italy. The alarm and the feelings of hostility which prevailed among the Gauls were greatly allayed by this message. They put their camp in motion and went on to Illiberis. The princes and high officers of their armies went to Hannibal's camp and were received with the highest marks of distinction and honor. They were loaded with presents and went away charmed with the affability, the wealth and generosity of their visitor. Instead of opposing his progress, they became the conductors and guides of his army. They took them first to Rusino, which was, as it were, their capital, and thence, after a short delay, the army moved on without any further molestation toward the Rhone. In the meantime, the Roman consul Scipio, having embarked the troops destined to meet Hannibal in 60 ships at the mouths of the Tiber, set sail for the mouth of the Rhone. The men were crowded together in the ships, as armies necessarily must be when transported by sea. They could not go far out to sea, for, as they had no compass in those days, there were no means of directing the course of navigation in case of storms or cloudy skies, except by the land. The ships accordingly made their way slowly along the shore, sometimes by means of sails and sometimes by oars, and, after suffering for some time the hardships and privations incident to such a voyage, the sea-sickness and the confinement of such swarming numbers in so narrow a space, bringing every species of discomfort in their train, the fleet entered the mouth of the Rhone. The officers had no idea that Hannibal was near. They had only heard of his having crossed the Iberus. They imagined that he was still on the other side of the Pyrenees. They entered the Rhone by the first branch they came to, for the Rhone, like the Nile, divides near its mouth and flows into the sea by several separate channels, and sailed without concern up to Marseilles, imagining that their enemy was still hundreds of miles away, entangled perhaps among the defiles of the Pyrenees. Instead of that, he was safely encamped upon the banks of the Rhone, a short distance above them, quietly and coolly making his arrangements for crossing it. When Cornelius got his men upon the land, they were too much exhausted by the sickness and misery they had endured upon the voyage to move on to meet Hannibal without some days for rest and refreshment. Cornelius, however, selected 300 horsemen who were able to move, and sent them up the river on an exploring expedition to learn the facts in respect to Hannibal and to report them to him. Dispatching them accordingly, he remained himself in his camp, reorganizing and recruiting his army, and awaiting the return of the party that he had sent to explore. Although Hannibal had thus far met with no serious opposition in his progress through Gaul, it must not on that account be supposed that the people through whose territories he was passing were really friendly to his cause or pleased with his presence among them. An army is always a burden and a curse to any country that it enters, even when its only object is to pass peacefully through. The Gauls assumed a friendly attitude toward this dreaded invader and his horde only because they thought that by so doing he would be sooner pass and be gone. They were too weak and had too few means of resistance to attempt to stop him, and as the next best thing that they could do resolved to render him every possible aid to hasten him on. This continued to be the policy of the various tribes until he reached the river. The people on the further side of the river, however, thought it was better for them to resist. They were nearer to the Roman territories and consequently somewhat more under Roman influence. They feared the resentment of the Romans if they should, even passively, render any cooperation to Hannibal in his designs. And as they had the broad and rapid river between them and their enemy, they thought there was a reasonable prospect that with its aid they could exclude him from their territories altogether. Thus it happened that when Hannibal came to the stream, the people on one side were all eager to promote, while those on the other were determined to prevent his passage, both parties being animated by the same desire to free their country from such a pest as the presence of an army of 90,000 men. So that Hannibal stood at last upon the banks of the river, with the people on his side of the stream, waiting and ready to furnish all the boats and vessels that they could command, and to render every aid in their power in their embarkation, while those on the other were drawn up in battle array, rank behind rank, glittering with weapons, marshalled so as to guard every place of landing, and lining with pikes the whole extent of the shore, while the peaks of their tents, in vast numbers with banners among them floating in the air, were to be seen in the distance behind them. All this time the 300 horsemen which Cornelius had dispatched were slowly and cautiously making their way up the river from the Roman encampment below. After contemplating the scene presented to his view at the river for some time in silence, Hannibal commenced his preparations for crossing the stream. He collected first all the boats of every kind which could be obtained among the Gauls who lived along the bank of the river. These, however, only served for a beginning, and so he next got together all the workmen and all the tools which the country could furnish for several miles around, and went to work constructing more. The Gauls of that region had a custom of making boats of the trunks of large trees. The tree, being felled and cut to the proper length, was hollowed out with hatchets and adzes, and then, being turned bottom upward, the outside was shaped in such a manner as to make it glide easily through the water. So convenient is this mode of making boats that it is practiced in cases where sufficiently large trees are found to the present day. Such boats are now called canoes. There were plenty of large trees on the banks of the Rhone. Hannibal's soldiers watched the Gauls at their work in making boats of them until they learned the art themselves. Some first assisted their new allies in the easier portions of the operation, and then began to fell large trees and make the boats themselves. Others, who had less skill or more impetuosity, chose not to wait for the slow process of hollowing the wood, and they accordingly would fell the trees upon the shore, cut the trunks of equal lengths, place them side by side in the water, and bolt or bind them together so as to form a raft. The form and fashion of their craft was of no consequence, they said, as it was for one passage only. Anything would answer, if it would only float and bear its burden over. In the meantime, the enemy upon the opposite shore looked on, but they could do nothing to impede these operations. If they had had artillery, such as is in use at the present day, they could have fired across the river and have blown the boats and rafts to pieces with balls and shells as fast as the Gauls and Carthaginians could build them. In fact, the workmen could not have built them under such a cannonading, but the enemy in this case had nothing but spears and arrows and stones to be thrown either by the hand or by engines far too weak to send them with any effect across such a stream. They had to look on quietly, therefore, and allow these great and formidable preparations for an attack upon them to go on without interruption. Their only hope was to overwhelm the army with their missiles and prevent their landing when they should reach the bank at last in their attempt to cross the stream. If an army is crossing a river without any enemy to oppose them, a moderate number of boats will serve, as a part of the army can be transported at a time, and the whole gradually transferred from one bank to the other by repeated trips of the same conveyances. But when there is an enemy to encounter at the landing, it is necessary to provide the means of carrying over a very large force at a time, for if a small division were to go over first alone, it would only throw itself weak and defenseless into the hands of the enemy. Hannibal therefore waited until he had boats, rafts and floats enough constructed to carry over a force altogether sufficiently numerous and powerful to attack the enemy with a prospect of success. The Romans, as we have already remarked, say that Hannibal's was cunning. He certainly was not disposed, like Alexander, to trust in his battles to simple superiority of bravery and force, but was always contriving some stratagem to increase the chances of victory. He did so in this case. He kept up for many days a prodigious parade and bustle of building boats and rafts in sight of his enemy, as if his sole reliance was on the multitude of men that he could pour across the river at a single transportation, and thus kept their attention closely riveted upon these preparations. All this time, however, he had another plan in course of execution. He had sent a strong body of troops secretly up the river, with orders to make their way stealthily through the forests and cross the stream some few miles above. This force was intended to move back from the river as soon as it should cross the stream and come down upon the enemy in the rear, so as to attack and harass them there at the same time that Hannibal was crossing with the main body of the army. If they succeeded in crossing the river safely, they were to build a fire in the woods on the other side, in order that the column of smoke which should ascend from it might serve as a signal of their success to Hannibal. This detachment was commanded by an officer named Hanno, of course a very different man from Hannibal's great enemy of that name in Carthage. Hanno set out in the night, moving back from the river, in commencing his march so as to be entirely out of sight from the gulls on the other side. He had some guides belonging to the country who promised to show him a convenient place for crossing. The party went up the river about 25 miles. Here they found a place where the water spread to a greater width and where the current was less rapid and the water not so deep. They got to this place in silence and secrecy, their enemies below not having suspected any such design. As they had therefore nobody to oppose them, they could cross much more easily than the main army below. They made some rafts for carrying over those of the men that could not swim, and such munitions of war as would be injured by the wet. The rest of the men waded till they reached the channel and then swam, supporting themselves in part by their bucklers which they had placed beneath their bodies in the water. Thus they all crossed in safety. They paused a day to dry their clothes and to rest, and then moved cautiously down the river until they were near enough to Hannibal's position to allow their signal to be seen. The fire was then built, and they gazed with exultation upon the column of smoke which ascended from it high into the air. Hannibal saw the signal, and now immediately prepared to cross with his army. The horsemen embarked in boats, holding their horses by lines, with a view of leading them into the water so that they might swim in company with the boats. Other horses, bridled and accoutred, were put into a large flat-bottomed boats to be taken across dry, in order that they might be all ready for service at the instant of landing. The most vigorous and efficient portion of the army were of course selected for the first passage, while all those who for any cause were weak or disabled remained behind with the stores and munitions of war to be transported afterward when the first passage should have been effected. All this time the enemy on the opposite shore were getting their ranks in array and making everything ready for a furious assault upon the invaders the moment they should approach the land. There was something like silence and order during the period while the men were embarking and pushing out from the land, but as they advanced into the current, the loud commands and shouts and outcries increased more and more, and the rapidity of the current and of the eddies by which the boats and rafts were hurried down the stream or wheeled against each other soon produced a terrific scene of tumult and confusion. As soon as the first boats approached the land, the Gauls assembled to oppose them rushed down upon them with showers of missiles and with those unearthly yells which barbarous warriors always raise in going into battle, as a means both of exciting themselves and of terrifying their enemy. Hannibal's officers urged the boats on and endeavored with as much coolness and deliberation as possible to effect a landing. It is perhaps doubtful how the contest would have ended had it not been for the detachment under Hanno, which now came suddenly into action. While the Gauls were in the height of their excitement in attempting to drive back the Carthaginians from the bank, they were thunderstruck at hearing the shouts and cries of an enemy behind them, and on looking around they saw the troops of Hanno pouring down upon them from the thickets with terrible impetuosity and force. It is very difficult for an army to fight both in front and in the rear at the same time. The Gauls, after a brief struggle, abandoned the attempt any longer to oppose Hannibal's landing. They fled down the river and back into the interior, leaving Hanno in secure possession of the bank, while Hannibal and his forces came up at their leisure out of the water, finding friends instead of enemies to receive them. The remainder of the army, together with the stores and munitions of war, were next to be transported, and this was accomplished with little difficulty now that there was no enemy to disturb their operations. There was one part of the force, however, which occasioned some trouble and delay. It was a body of elephants which formed a part of the army. How to get these unwieldy animals across so broad and rapid a river was a question of no little difficulty. There are various accounts of the manner in which Hannibal accomplished the object, from which it would seem that different methods were employed. One mode was as follows. The keeper of the elephants selected one more spirited and passionate in disposition than the rest, and contrived to tease and torment him so as to make him angry. The elephant advanced towards his keeper with his trunk raised to take vengeance. The keeper fled, the elephant pursued him, the other elephants of the herd following, as is the habit of the animal on such occasions. The keeper ran into the water as if to elude his pursuer, while the elephant and a large part of the herd pressed on after him. The man swam into the channel, and the elephants, before they could check themselves, found that they were beyond their depth. Some swam on after the keeper and crossed the river, where they were easily secured. Others, terrified, abandoned themselves to the current and were floated down, struggling helplessly as they went, until at last they grounded upon shallows or points of land, whence they gained the shore again, some on one side of the stream and some on the other. The plan was thus only partially successful, and Hannibal devised a more effectual method for the remainder of the troop. He built an immensely large raft, floated it up to the shore, fastened it there securely, and covered it with earth, turf, and bushes, so as to make it resemble a projection of the land. He then caused a second raft to be constructed of the same size, and this he brought up to the outer edge of the other, fastened it there by a temporary connection, and covered and concealed it as he had done the first. The first of these rafts extended 200 feet from the shore and was 50 feet broad. The other, that is, the outer one, was only a little smaller. The soldiers then contrived to allure and drive the elephants over these rafts to the outer one, the animals imagining that they had not left the land. The two rafts were then disconnected from each other, and the outer one began to move with its bulky passengers over the water, towed by a number of boats which had previously been attached to its outer edge. As soon as the elephants perceived the motion, they were alarmed and began immediately to look anxiously this way and that, and to crowd toward the edges of the raft which was conveying them away. They found themselves hemmed in by water on every side, and were terrified and thrown into confusion. Some were crowded off into the river, and were drifted down till they landed below. The rest soon became calm, and allowed themselves to be quietly ferried across the stream, when they found that all hope of escape and resistance were equally vain. In the meantime, while these events were occurring, the troop of 300 which Sipo had sent up the river to see what tidings he could learn of the Carthaginians were slowly making their way toward the point where Hannibal was crossing. And it happened that Hannibal had sent down a troop of 500 when he first reached the river to see if they could learn any tidings of the Romans. Neither of the armies had any idea how near they were to the other. The two detachments met suddenly and unexpectedly on the way. They were sent to explore and not to fight, but as they were nearly equally matched, each was ambitious of the glory of capturing the others and carrying them prisoners to their camp. They fought a long and bloody battle. A great number were killed, and in about the same proportion on either side. The Romans say they conquered. We do not know what the Carthaginians said, but as both parties retreated from the field and went back to their respective camps, it is safe to infer that neither could boast of a very decisive victory. End of chapter 4. Recording by Sławek Księżycki.
Chapter 5 of Hannibal. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Meilinger. Hannibal by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 5. Hannibal crosses the Alps. It is difficult for anyone who has not actually seen such mountain scenery as is presented by the Alps to form any clear conception of its magnificence and grandeur. Hannibal had never seen the Alps, but the world was filled then, as now, with their fame. Some of the leading features of sublimity and grandeur which these mountains exhibit results mainly from the perpetual cold which reigns upon their summits. This is owing simply to their elevation. In every part of the earth, as we ascend from the surface of the ground into the atmosphere, it becomes, for some mysterious reason or other, more and more cold as we rise, so that over our heads, wherever we are, there reigns, at a distance of 2 or 3 miles above us, an intense and perpetual cold. This is true not only in the cool and temperate latitudes, but also in the most torrid regions of the globe. If we were to ascend in a balloon at Borneo at midday, when the burning sun of the tropics was directly over our heads, to an elevation of 5 or 6 miles, we should find that although we had been moving nearer to the sun all the time, its rays would have lost gradually all their power. They would fall upon us as brightly as ever, but their heat would be gone. They would feel like moonbeams, and we should be surrounded with an atmosphere as frosty as that of the icebergs in the frigid zone. It is from this region of perpetual cold that hailstones descend upon us in the midst of summer, and snow is continually forming and falling there, but the light and fleeky flakes melt before they reach the earth, so that while the hail has such solidity and momentum that it forces its way through, the snow dissolves, and falls upon us as a cool and refreshing rain. Rain cools the air around us and the ground, because it comes from cooler regions of the air above. Now it happens that not only the summits, but extensive portions of the upper declivities of the Alps rise into the region of perpetual winter. Of course, ice congeals continually there, and the snow which forms falls to the ground as snow, and accumulates in vast and permanent stores. The summit of Mont Blanc is covered with a bed of snow of enormous thickness, which is almost as much a permanent geological stratum of the mountain as the granite which lies beneath it. Of course, during the winter months, the whole country of the Alps, valley as well as hill, is covered with snow. In the spring the snow melts in the valleys and plains, and higher up it becomes damp and heavy with partial melting, and slides down in the declivities in vast avalanches, which sometimes are of such enormous magnitude, and descend with such resistless force, as to bring down earth, rocks, and even the trees of the forest in their train. On the higher declivities, however, and over all the rounded summits, the snow still clings to its place, yielding but very little to the feeble beams of the sun, even in July. There are vast ravines and valleys among the higher Alps, where the snow accumulates, being driven into them by winds and storms in the winter, and sliding into them with great avalanches in the spring. These vast depositories of snow become changed into ice below the surface, for at the surface there is a continual melting, and the water, flowing down through the mass, freezes below. Thus there are valleys, or rather ravines, some of them 2 or 3 miles wide, and 10 or 15 miles long, filled with ice, transparent, solid, and blue, hundreds of feet in deep. They are called glaciers, and what is most astonishing in respect to these icy accumulations is that, though the ice is perfectly compact and solid, the whole mass is found to be continually in a state of slow motion down the valley in which it lies, at the rate of about a foot in 24 hours. By standing upon the surface and listening attentively, we hear from time to time a grinding sound. The rocks which lie along the sides are pulverized, and are continually moving against each other and falling, and then, besides, which is a more direct and positive proof still of the motion of the mass, a mark may be set up upon the ice, as has been often done, and marks corresponding to it made upon the solid rocks on each side of the valley, and by this means the fact of the motion, and the exact rate of it, may be fully ascertained. Thus these valleys are really and literally rivers of ice, rising among the summits of the mountains, and flowing slowly, it is true, but with a continuous and certain current, to a sort of mount in some great and open valley below. Here the streams which have flown over the surface above, and descended into the mass, through countless crevices and chasms, into which the traveller looks down with terror, concentrate and issue from under the ice in a turbid torrent, which comes out from a vast archway made by the falling in of the masses which the water has undermined. This lower end of the glacier sometimes presents a perpendicular wall hundreds of feet in height, sometimes it crowds down into the fertile valley, advancing in some unusually cold summer into a cultivated country, where, as it slowly moves on, it ploughs up the ground, carries away the orchard and fields, and even drives the inhabitants from the villages which it threatens. If the next summer proves warm, the terrible monster slowly draws back its rigid head, and the inhabitants return to the ground it reluctantly evacuates, and attempt to repair the damage it has done. The Alps lie between France and Italy, and the great valleys and the ranges of mountain land lie in such a direction that they must be crossed in order to pass from one country to the other. These ranges are, however, not regular. They are traversed by innumerable chasms, fissures, and ravines. In some places they rise in vast rounded summits and swells, covered with fields of spotless snow. In others they tower in lofty, needle-like peaks, which even the chamois cannot scale, and where scarcely a flake of snow can find a place of rest. Around and among these peaks and summits, and through these frightful defiles and chasms, the roads twist and turn, in a zigzag and constantly ascending course, creeping along the most frightful precipices, sometimes beneath them and sometimes on the brink, penetrating the darkest and gloomiest defiles, skirting the most impetuous and foaming torrents, and at last, perhaps, emerging upon the surface of a glacier, to be lost in interminable fields of ice and snow, where countless brooks run in glassy channels, and crevices yawn, ready to take advantage of any slip which may enable them to take down the traveller into their bottomless abysses. And yet, notwithstanding the awful desolation which reigns in the upper regions of the Alps, the lower valleys, through which the streams finally meander out into the open plains, and by which the traveller gains access to the sublimer scenes of the upper mountains, are inexpressibly verdant and beautiful. They are fertilized by the deposits of continual inundations in the early spring, and the sun beats down into them with a genial warmth in summer, which brings out millions of flowers, of the most beautiful forms and colours, and ripens rapidly the broadest and richest fields of grain. Cottages, of every picturesque and beautiful form, tenanted by the cultivators, the shepherds and herdsmen, crown every little swell in the bottom of the valley, and cling to the declivities of the mountains which rise on either hand. Above them eternal forests of firs and pines wave, feathering over the steepest and most rocky slopes with their sombre foliage. Still higher grey precipices rise, and spires and pinnacles, far grander and more picturesque, if not so symmetrically formed, than those constructed by man. Between these there is seen here and there in the background vast towering masses of white and dazzling snow, which crown the summits of the loftier mountains beyond. Hannibal's determination to carry an army into Italy by way of the Alps, instead of transporting them by galleys over the sea, has always been regarded as one of the greatest undertakings of ancient times. He hesitated for some time whether he should go down the Rhone and meet and give battle to Scipio, or whether he should leave the Roman army to its course and proceed himself directly toward the Alps and Italy. The officers and soldiers of the army, who had now learned something of their destination and of their leader's plans, wanted to go and meet the Romans. They dreaded the Alps. They were willing to encounter a military foe, however formidable, for this was a danger that they were accustomed to and could understand, but their imagination were appalled at the novel and awful images they formed of falling down precipices, of ragged rocks, or of gradually freezing and being buried half alive, during the process, in eternal snows. Hannibal, when he found that his soldiers were afraid to proceed, called the leading portions of his army together, and made them an address. He remonstrated with them for yielding now to unworthy fears, after having successfully met and triumphed over such dangers as they had already incurred. "You have surmounted the Pyrenees," said he. "You have crossed the Rhone. You are now actually in sight of the Alps, which are the very gates of access to the country of the enemy. What do you conceive the Alps to be? They are nothing but high mountains, after all. Suppose they are higher than the Pyrenees. They do not reach to the skies, and, since they do not, they cannot be insurmountable. They are surmounted, in fact, every day. They are even inhabited and cultivated, and travellers continually pass over them to and fro. And what a single man can do, an army can do, for an army is only a large number of single men. In fact, to a soldier, who has nothing to carry with him but the implements of war, no way can be too difficult to be surmounted by courage and energy." After finishing his speech, Hannibal, finding his men reanimated and encouraged by what he had said, ordered them to go to their tents and refresh themselves, and prepare to march on the following day. They made no further opposition to going on. Hannibal did not, however, proceed at once directly toward the Alps. He did not know what the plans of Scipio might be, who, it will be recollected, was below him on the Rhone, with the Roman army. He did not wish to waste his time and his strength in the contest with Scipio in Gaul, but to press on and get across the Alps into Italy as soon as possible. And so, fearing lest Scipio should strike across the country, and intercept him if he should attempt to go by the most direct route, he determined to move northwardly, up the river Rhone, till he should get well into the interior, with a view of reaching the Alps ultimately by a more circuitous journey. It was, in fact, the plan of Scipio to come up with Hannibal and attack him as soon as possible. And accordingly, as soon as his horsemen, or rather those who were left alive after the battle, had returned and informed him that Hannibal and his army were near, he put his camp in motion and moved rapidly up the river. He arrived at the place where the Carthaginians had crossed a few days after they had gone. The spot was in a terrible state of ruin and confusion. The grass and the herbage were trampled down for a circuit of a mile, and all over the space were spots of black and smouldering remains, where the campfires had been kindled. The tops and branches of trees lay everywhere around, their leaves withering in the sun, and the groves and forests were encumbered with limbs, and rejected trunks, and trees felled and left where they lay. The shore was lined far down the stream with ruins of boats and rafts, with weapons which had been lost or abandoned, and with the bodies of those who had been drowned in the passage or killed in a contest on the shore. These and numerous other vestiges remained, but the army was gone. There were, however, upon the ground groups of natives and other visitors, who had come to look at the spot now destined to become so memorable in history. From these men Scipio learned when and where Hannibal had gone. He decided that it was useless to attempt to pursue him. He was greatly perplexed to know what to do. In the casting of lots, Spain had fallen to him, but now that the great enemy, who had come forth to meet, had left Spain altogether, his only hope of intercepting his progress was to sail back into Italy, and meet him as he came down from the Alps into the great valley of the Po. Still, as Spain had been assigned to him as his province, he could not well entirely abandon it. He accordingly sent forward the largest part of his army into Spain to attack the forces that Hannibal had left there, while he himself with a smaller force went down to the seashore and sailed back to Italy again. He expected to find Roman forces in the valley of the Po, with which he hoped to be strong enough to meet Hannibal as he descended from the mountains, if he should succeed in effecting a passage over them. In the meantime Hannibal went on, drawing nearer and nearer to the ranges of snowy summits which his soldiers had seen for many days in their eastern horizon. These ranges were very resplendent and grand when the sun went down into the west, for then it shone directly upon them. As the army approached nearer and nearer to them, and gradually withdrew from sight and disappeared, being concealed by intervening summits less lofty, but nearer. As the soldiers went on, however, they began to penetrate the valleys, and draw near to the awful chasms and precipices among the mountains, and saw the turbid torrents descending from them. Their fears revived. It was, however, now too late to retreat. They pressed forward, ascending continually, till their road grew extremely precipitous and insecure, threading its way through almost impassable defiles, with rugged cliffs overhanging them, and snowy summits towering all around. At last they came to a narrow defile, through which they must necessarily pass, but which was guarded by large bodies of armed men assembled on the rocks and precipices above, ready to hurl stones and weapons of every kind upon them if they should attempt to pass through. The army halted. Hannibal ordered them to encamp where they were, until he could consider what to do. In the course of the day he learned that the mountaineers did not remain at their elevated post during the night, on account of the intense cold and exposure, knowing, too, that it would be impossible for an army to traverse such a pass as they were attempting to guard without daylight to guide them, for the road, or rather pathway, which passes through these defiles, follows generally the course of a mountain torrent, which flows through the succession of frightful ravines and chasms, and often passes along on a shelf or projection of the rock, hundreds and sometimes thousands of feet from the bed of the stream, which foams and roars far below. There could of course, be no hope of passing safely by such a route without the light of day. The mountaineers, therefore, knowing that it was not necessary to guard the pass at night, its own terrible danger being then a sufficient protection, were accustomed to disperse in the evening, and descend to regions where they could find shelter and repose, and to return and renew their watch in the morning. When Hannibal learned this, he determined to anticipate them in getting up upon the rocks the next day, and, in order to prevent their entertaining any suspicion of his design, he pretended to be making all the arrangements for encamping for the night on the ground he had taken. He accordingly pitched more tents, and built, toward evening, a great many fires, and he began some preparations, indicating that it was his intention the next day to force his way through the pass. He moved forward a strong detachment up to a point near the entrance to the pass, and put them in a fortified position there, as if to have them all ready to advance when the proper time should arrive on the following day. The mountaineers, seeing all these preparations going on, looked forward to a conflict on the morrow, and, during the night, left their positions as usual, to descend to places of shelter. The next morning, however, when they began at an early hour to ascend to them again, they were astonished to find all the lofty rocks and cliffs and shelving projections which overhung the pass covered with Carthaginians. Hannibal had aroused a strong body of his men at the earliest dawn, and led them up by steep climbing to the places which the mountaineers had left, so as to be there before them. The mountaineers paused, astonished at this spectacle, and their disappointment and rage were such increased on looking down into the valley below, and seeing there the remainder of the Carthaginian army quietly moving through the pass in a long train, safe apparently from any molestations, since friends and not enemies were now in possession of the cliffs above. The mountaineers could not restrain their feelings of vexation and anger, but immediately rushed down the declivities which they had in part ascended, and attacked the army in the defile. An awful scene of struggle and confusion ensued. Some were killed by weapons or by rocks rolled down upon them. Others, contending together, and struggling desperately in places of every narrow foothold, tumbled along down the rugged rocks into the torrent below, and horses, laden with baggage and stores, became frightened and unmanageable, and crowded each other over the most frightful precipices. Hannibal, who was above the higher rocks, looked down upon this scene for a time with the greatest anxiety and terror. He did not dare to descend himself and mingle in the affray, for fear of increasing the confusion. He soon found, however, that it was absolutely necessary for him to interpose, and he came down as rapidly as possible, his detachment with him. They descended by oblique and zigzag paths, wherever they could get footing among the rocks, and attacked the mountaineers with great fury. The result was, as he had feared, a great increase at first of the confusion and the slaughter. The horses were more and more terrified by the fresh energy of the combat, and by the resounding of louder shouts and cries, which were made doubly terrific by the echoes and the reverberations of the mountains. They crowded against each other, and fell, horses and men together, in masses, over the cliffs to the rugged rocks below, where they lay in confusion, some dead, and others dying, writhing helplessly in agony, or vainly endeavoring to crawl away. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Hannibal. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Hannibal by Jacob Abbott. Hannibal crosses the Alps. Part 2. The mountaineers were, however, conquered and driven away at last, and the pass was left clear. The Carthaginian column was restored to order. The horses that had not fallen were calmed and quieted. The baggage which had been thrown down was gathered up, and the wounded men were placed on litters, rudely constructed on the spot, that they might be borne on to a place of safety. In a short time all were ready to move on, and the march was accordingly recommenced. There was no further difficulty. The column advanced in a quiet and orderly manner until they had passed the defile. At the extremity of it they came to a spacious fort belonging to the natives. Hannibal took possession of this fort and paused for a little time there to rest and refresh his men. One of the greatest difficulties encountered by a general in conducting an army through difficult and dangerous roads is that of providing food for them. An army can transport its own food only a very little way. Men traveling over smooth roads can only carry provisions for a few days, and where the roads are as difficult and dangerous as the passes of the Alps, they can scarcely carry any. The commander must, accordingly, find subsistence in the country through which he is marching. Hannibal had, therefore, now not only to look out for the safety of his men, but their food was exhausted, and he must take immediate measures to secure a supply. The lower slopes of lofty mountains afford usually abundant sustenance for flocks and herds. The showers which are continually falling there, and the moisture which comes down the sides of the mountains through the ground, keep the turf perpetually green, and sheep and cattle love to pasture upon it. They climb to great heights, finding the herbage finer and sweeter the higher they go. Thus the inhabitants of mountain ranges are almost always shepherds and herdsmen. Grain can be raised in the valleys below, but the slopes of the mountains, though they produce grass to perfection, are too steep to be tilled. As soon as Hannibal had got established in the fort, he sent around small bodies of men to seize and drive in all the cattle and sheep that they could find. These men were, of course, armed, in order that they might be prepared to meet any resistance which they might encounter. The mountaineers, however, did not attempt to resist them. They felt that they were conquered, and they were accordingly disheartened and discouraged. The only mode of saving their cattle, which was left to them, was to drive them as fast as they could into concealed and inaccessible places. They attempted to do this, and while Hannibal's parties were ranging up the valleys all around them, examining every field and barn and sheepfold that they could find, the wretched and despairing inhabitants were flying in all directions, driving the cows and sheep, on which their whole hope of subsistence depended, into the fastnesses of the mountains. They urged them into wild thickets, and dark ravines and chasms, and over dangerous glaciers, and up the steepest ascents, wherever there was the readiest prospect of getting them out of the plunderers' way. These attempts, however, to save their little property were but very partially successful. Hannibal's marauding parties kept coming home, one after another, with droves of sheep and cattle before them, some larger and some smaller, but making up a vast amount in all. Hannibal subsisted his men 3 days on the food thus procured for them. It requires an enormous store to feed 90 or 100,000 men, even for 3 days. Besides, in all such cases as this, an army always waste and destroy far more than they really consume. During these 3 days the army was not stationary, but was moving slowly on. The way, though still difficult and dangerous, was at least open before them, as there was now no enemy to dispute their passage. So they went on, rioting upon the abundant supplies they had obtained, and rejoicing in the double victory they were gaining over the hostility of the people and the physical dangers and difficulties of the way. The poor mountaineers returned to their cabins, ruined and desolate, for mountaineers who have lost their cows and their sheep have lost their all. The Alps are not all in Switzerland. Some of the most celebrated peaks and ranges are in a neighboring state called Savoy. The whole country is, in fact, divided into small states, called cantons, at the present day, and similar political divisions seem to have existed in the time of the Romans. In his march onward from the pass which has been already described, Hannibal, accordingly, soon approached the confines of another canton. As he was advancing slowly into it, with the long train of his army winding up with him through the valleys, he was met at the borders of this new state by an embassage sent from the government of it. They brought with them fresh stores of provisions and a number of guides. They said that they had heard of the terrible destruction which had come upon the other canton in consequence of their effort to oppose his progress, and that they had no intention of renewing so vain an attempt. They came, therefore, they said, to offer Hannibal their friendship and their aid. They had brought guides to show the army the best way over the mountains, and a present of provisions, and to prove the sincerity of their professions, they offered Hannibal hostages. These hostages were young men and boys, and sons of the principal inhabitants, whom they offered to deliver into Hannibal's power, to be kept by him until he should see that they were faithful and true in doing what they offered. Hannibal was so accustomed to stratagem and treachery himself that he was at first very much at a loss to decide whether these offers and professions were honest and sincere, or whether they were only made to put him off his guard. He thought it possible that it was their design to induce him to place himself under their direction, so that they might lead him into some dangerous defile or labyrinth of rocks from which he could not extricate himself, and where they could attack and destroy him. He, however, decided to return them a favorable answer, but to watch them very carefully, and to proceed under their guidance with the utmost caution and care. He accepted of the provisions they offered, and took the hostages. These last he delivered into the custody of a body of his soldiers, and they marched on with the rest of the army. Then, directing the new guides to lead the way, the army moved on after them. The elephants went first, with a moderate force for their protection preceding and accompanying them. Then came long trains of horses and mules, loaded with military stores and baggage, and finally the foot soldiers followed, marching irregularly in a long column. The whole train must have extended many miles, and must have appeared from any of the eminences around like an enormous serpent winding its way tortuously through the wild and desolate valleys. Hannibal was right in his suspicions. The embassage was a stratagem. The men who sent it had laid an ambuscade in a very narrow pass, concealing their forces in thickets and in chasms, and in nooks and corners among the rugged rocks, and when the guides had led the army well into the danger, a sudden signal was given, and these concealed enemies rushed down upon them in great numbers, breaking into their ranks, and renewing the scene of terrible uproar, tumult, and destruction which had been witnessed in the other defile. One would have thought that the elephants, being so unwieldy and so helpless in such a scene, would have been the first objects of attack, but it was not so. The mountaineers were afraid of them. They had never seen such animals before, and they felt for them a mysterious awe, not knowing what terrible powers such enormous beasts might be expected to wield. They kept away from them, therefore, and from the horsemen, and poured down upon the head of the column of foot soldiers which followed in the rear. They were quite successful at the first onset. They broke through the head of the column and drove the rest back. The horses and elephants, in the meantime, moved forward, bearing the baggage with them, so that the two portions of the army were soon entirely separated. Hannibal was behind, with the soldiers. The mountaineers made good their position, and as night came on, the contest ceased, for in such wilds as these no one can move at all except with the light of day. The mountaineers, however, remained in their place, dividing the army, and Hannibal continued during the night in a state of great suspense and anxiety, with the elephants and the baggage separated from him, and apparently at the mercy of the enemy. During the night he made vigorous preparations for attacking the mountaineers the next day. As soon as the morning light appeared, he made the attack, and he succeeded in driving the enemy away, so far at least as to allow him to get his army together again. He then began once more to move on. The mountaineers, however, hovered about his way, and did all they could to molest and embarrass his march. They concealed themselves in ambuscades, and attacked the Carthaginians as they passed. They rolled stones down upon them, or discharged spears and arrows from eminences above. And if any of Hannibal's army became, for any reason, detached from the rest, they would cut off their retreat, and then take them prisoners, or destroy them. Thus they gave Hannibal a great deal of trouble. They harassed his march continually, without presenting at any point a force where he could meet and encounter in battle. Of course, Hannibal could no longer trust to his guides, and he was obliged to make his way as he best could, sometimes right, but often wrong, and exposed to 1,000 difficulties and dangers, which those acquainted with the country might have easily avoided. All this time the mountaineers were continually attacking him, in bands like those of robbers, sometimes in the van and sometimes in the rear, wherever the nature of the ground or the circumstances of the marching army afforded them an opportunity. Hannibal persevered, however, through all these discouragements, protecting his men as far as it was in his power, but pressing earnestly on until in 9 days he reached the summit. By the summit, however, is not meant the summit of the mountains, but the summit of the pass, that is the highest point which it was necessary for him to attain in going over. In all mountain ranges there are depressions, which are in Switzerland called necks, and the pathways and roads over the ranges lie always in these. In America, such a depression in a ridge of land, if well marked and decided, is called a notch. Hannibal attained the highest point of the col, by which he was to pass over, in 9 days after the great battle. There were, however, of course, lofty peaks and summits towering still far above him. He encamped here 2 days to rest and refresh his men. The enemy no longer molested him. In fact, parties were continually coming into the camp of men and horses that had got lost or had been left in the valleys below. They came in slowly, some wounded, others exhausted and spent by fatigue and exposure. In some cases, horses came in alone. They were horses that had slipped or stumbled and fallen among the rocks, or had sunk down exhausted by their toil, and had thus been left behind, and afterward, recovering their strength, had followed on, led by a strange instinct to keep to the tracks which their companions had made, and thus they rejoined the camp at last in safety. In fact, one great reason for Hannibal's delay at his encampment on or near the summit of the pass was to afford time for all the missing men to join the army again, that had the power to do so. Had it not been for this necessity, he would doubtless have descended some distance, at least, to a more warm and sheltered position before seeking repose. A more gloomy and desolate resting place than the summit of an alpine pass can scarcely be found. The bare and barren rocks are entirely destitute of vegetation, and they have lost, besides, the sublime and picturesque forms which they assume further below. They spread in vast naked fields in every direction around the spectator, rising in gentle ascents, bleak and dreary, the surface whitened as if bleached by the perpetual rains. Storms are, in fact, almost perpetual in these elevated regions. The vast cloud, which to the eye of the shepherd in the valley below seems only a fleecy cap, resting serenely upon the summit, or slowly floating along the sides, is really a driving mist, or cold and stormy rain, howling dismally over interminable fields of broken rocks, as if angry that it can make nothing grow upon them with all its watering. Thus there are seldom distant views to be obtained, and everything near presents a scene of simple dreariness and desolation. Hannibal's soldiers thus found themselves in the midst of a dismal scene in their lofty encampment. There is one special source of danger, too, in such places as this, which the lower portions of the mountains are less exposed to, and that is the entire obliteration of the pathway by falls of snow. It seems almost absurd to speak of pathway in such regions where there is no turf to be worn, and the boundless fields of rocks, ragged and hard, will take no trace of footsteps. There are, however, generally some faint traces of way, and where these fail entirely, the track is sometimes indicated by small piles of stones, placed at intervals along the line of a route. An unpractised eye would scarcely distinguish these little landmarks, in many cases, from accidental heaps of stones, which lie everywhere around. They, however, render a very essential service to the guides and to the mountaineers, who have been accustomed to conduct their steps by similar aids in other portions of the mountains. But when snow begins to fall, all these and every other possible means of distinguishing the way are soon entirely obliterated. The whole surface of the ground, or rather of the rocks, is covered, and all landmarks disappear. The little monuments become nothing but slight inequalities in the surface of the snow, undistinguishable from 1,000 others. The air is thick and murky, and shuts off alike all distant prospects and the shape and conformation of the land that is near. The bewildered traveler has not even the stars to guide him, as there is nothing but dark, falling flakes, descending from an impenetrable canopy of stormy clouds, to be seen in the sky. Hannibal encountered a snowstorm while on the summit of the pass, and his army were very much terrified by it. It was now November. The army had met with so many detentions and delays that their journey had been protracted to a late period. It would be unsafe to attempt to wait till this snow should melt again. As soon, therefore, as the storm ended and the clouds cleared away, so as to allow the men to see the general features of the country around, the camp was broken up and the army put in motion. The soldiers marched through the snow with great anxiety and fear. Men went before to explore the way, and to guide the rest by flags and banners which they bore. Those who went first made paths, of course, for those who followed behind, as the snow was trampled down by their footsteps. Notwithstanding these aids, however, the army moved on very laboriously and with much fear. At length, however, after descending a short distance, Hannibal, perceiving that they must soon come in sight of the Italian valleys and plains which lay beyond the Alps, went forward among the pioneers, who had charge of the banners by which the movements of the army were directed, and as soon as the open country began to come into view, he selected a spot where the widest prospect was presented, and halted his army there to let them take a view of the beautiful country which now lay before them. The Alps are very precipitous on the Italian side. The descent is very sudden, from the cold and icy summits to a broad expanse of the most luxuriant and sunny plains. Upon these plains, which were spread out in a most enchanting landscape at their feet, Hannibal and his soldiers now looked down with exultation and delight. Beautiful lakes, studded with still more beautiful islands, reflected the beams of the sun. An endless succession of fields in sober autumnal colors, with the cottages of the laborers and stacks of grain scattered here and there upon them, and rivers meandering through verdant meadows, gave variety and enchantment to the view. Hannibal made an address to his officers and men, congratulating them on having arrived, at last, so near to a successful termination of their toils. The difficulties of the way, he said, are at last surmounted, and these mighty barriers that we have scaled are the walls not only of Italy, but of Rome itself. Since we have passed the Alps, the Romans will have no protection against us remaining. It is only one battle when we get down upon the plains, or at most two, and the great city itself will be entirely at our disposal. The whole army were much animated and encouraged, both by the prospect which presented itself to their view and by the words of Hannibal. They prepared for the descent, anticipating little difficulty, but they found, on recommencing their march, that their troubles were by no means over. The mountains are far steeper on the Italian side than on the other, and it was extremely difficult to find paths by which the elephants and the horses, and even the men, could safely descend. They moved on for some time with great labor and fatigue, until at length Hannibal, looking on before, found that the head of the column had stopped, and the whole train behind was soon jammed together, the ranks halting along the way in succession, as they found their path blocked up by the halting of those before them. Hannibal sent forward to ascertain the cause of the difficulty, and found that the van of the army had reached a precipice down which it was impossible to descend. It was necessary to make a circuit in hopes of finding some practicable way of getting down. The guides and pioneers went on, leading the army after them, and soon got upon a glacier which lay in their way. There was fresh snow upon the surface, covering the ice and concealing the crevasses, as they are termed, that is, the great cracks and fissures which extend in the glaciers down through the body of the ice. The army moved on, trampling down the new snow, and making at first a good roadway by their footsteps, but very soon the old ice and snow began to be trampled up by the hoofs of the horses and the heavy tread of such vast multitudes of armed men. It softened to a great depth, and made the work of toiling through it an enormous labor. Besides, the surface of the ice and snow sloped steeply, and the men and beasts were continually falling or sliding down, and getting swallowed up in avalanches which their own weight set in motion, or in concealed crevasses where they sank to rise no more. They, however, made some progress, though slowly, and with great danger. They at last got below the region of the snow, but here they encountered new difficulties in the abruptness and ruggedness of the rocks, and in the zigzag and tortuous direction of the way. At last they came to a spot where their further progress appeared to be entirely cut off by a large mass of rock, which it seemed necessary to remove in order to widen the passage sufficiently to allow them to go on. The Roman historian says that Hannibal removed these rocks by building great fires upon them and then pouring on vinegar, which opened seams and fissures in them, by means of which the rocks could be split and pried to pieces with wedges and crowbars. On reading this account, the mind naturally pauses to consider the probability of its being true. As they had no gunpowder in those days, they were compelled to resort to some such method as the one above described for removing rocks. There are some species of rock which are easily cracked and broken by the action of fire. Others resist it. There seems, however, to be no reason obvious why vinegar should materially assist in the operation. Besides, we cannot suppose that Hannibal could have had, at such a time and place, any very large supply of vinegar on hand. On the whole, it is probable that, if any such operation was performed at all, it was on a very small scale, and the results must have been very insignificant at the time, though the fact has since been greatly celebrated in history. In coming over the snow, and in descending the rocks immediately below, the army, and especially the animals connected with it, suffered a great deal from hunger. It was difficult to procure forage for them of any kind. At length, however, as they continued their descent, they came first into the region of forests, and soon after to slopes of grassy fields descending into warm and fertile valleys. Here the animals were allowed to stop and rest, and renew their strength by abundance of food. The men rejoiced that their toils and dangers were over, and descending easily the remainder of the way, they encamped at last safely on the plains of Italy. In Modesto, California, for LibriVox.
Chapter 7 of Hannibal. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hannibal by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 7. Hannibal in the north of Italy. When Hannibal's army found themselves on the plain of Italy, and sat down quietly to repose, they felt the effects of their fatigues and exposures far more sensibly than they had done under the excitement which they naturally felt while actually upon the mountains. They were in fact in miserable condition. Hannibal told a Roman officer whom he afterward took prisoner, that more than 30,000 perished on the way in crossing the mountains, some in the battles which were fought in the passes, and a greater number still, probably, from exposure to fatigue and cold, and from falls among the rocks and glaciers, and diseases produced by destitution and misery. The remnant of the army, which was left on reaching the plain, were emaciated, sickly, ragged, and spiritless, far more inclined to lie down and die than to go on and undertake the conquest of Italy and Rome. After some days, however, they began to recruit. Although they had been half-starved among the mountains, they had now plenty of wholesome food. They repaired their tattered garments and their broken weapons. They talked with one another about the terrific scenes through which they had been passing, and the dangers which they had surmounted, and thus gradually strengthening their impressions of the greatness of the exploits they had performed, they began soon to awaken in each other's breasts an ambition to go on and undertake the accomplishment of other deeds of daring and glory. We left Scipio with his army at the mouth of the Rhone, about to set sail for Italy with a part of his force, while the rest of it was sent on toward Spain. Scipio sailed along the coast by Genoa, and thence to Pisa, where he landed. He stopped a little while to recruit his soldiers after the voyage, and in the meantime sent orders to all the Roman forces then in the north of Italy to join his standard. He hoped in this way to collect a force strong enough to encounter Hannibal. This arrangement being made, he marched to the northward as rapidly as possible. He knew in what condition Hannibal's army had descended from the Alps, and wished to attack them before they should have time to recover from the effects of their privations and sufferings. He reached the Po before he saw anything of Hannibal. Hannibal, in the meantime, was not idle. As soon as his men were in a condition to move, he began to act upon the tribes that he found at the foot of the mountains, offering his friendship to some and attacking others. He thus conquered those who attempted to resist him, moving all the time gradually southward toward the Po. That river has numerous branches, and among them is one named the Ticinus. It was on the banks of this river that the two armies at last came together. Both generals must have felt some degree of solicitude in respect to the result of the contest which was about to take place. Scipio knew very well Hannibal's terrible efficiency as a warrior, and he was himself a general of great distinction and a Roman, so that Hannibal had no reason to anticipate a very easy victory. Whatever doubts or fears, however, general officers may feel on the eve of an engagement, it is always considered very necessary to conceal them entirely from the men, and to animate and encourage the troops with most undoubting confidence that they will gain the victory. Both Hannibal and Scipio, accordingly, made addresses to their respective armies, at least so say the historians of those times, each one expressing to his followers the certainty that the other side would easily be beaten. The speech attributed to Scipio was somewhat as follows. I wish to say a few words to you, soldiers, before we go into battle. It certainly would not be necessary if I had now under my command the same troops that I took with me to the mouth of the Rhone. They knew the Carthaginians there, and would not have feared them here. A body of our horsemen met and attacked a larger body of theirs, and defeated them. We then advanced with our whole force toward their encampment, in order to give them battle. They, however, abandoned the ground and retreated before we reached the spot acknowledging by their flight their own fear and our superiority. If you had been with us there and had witnessed these facts, there would have been no need that I should say anything to convince you now how easily you are going to defeat this Carthaginian foe. We have had a war with this same nation before. We conquered them then, both by land and sea. And when finally peace was made, we required them to pay us tribute, and we continued to exact it from them for 20 years. They are a conquered nation, and now this miserable army has forced its way insanely over the Alps, just to throw itself into our hands. They meet us reduced in numbers and exhausted in resources and strength. More than half of the army perished in the mountains, and those that survive are weak, dispirited, ragged, and diseased, and yet they are compelled to meet us. If there was any chance for retreat, or any possible way for them to avoid the necessity of a battle, they would avail themselves of it. But there is not. They are hemmed in by the mountains, which are now, to them, an impassable wall, for they have not strength to scale them again. They are not real enemies. They are the mere remnants and shadows of enemies. They are wholly disheartened and discouraged, their strength and energy, both of soul and body, being spent and gone through the cold, the hunger, and the squalid misery they have endured. Their joints are benumbed, their sinews stiffened, and their forms emaciated. Their armor is shattered and broken, their horses are lamed, and all their equipments worn out and ruined. So that really what most I fear is that the world will refuse us the glory of the victory, and say that it was the Alps that conquered Hannibal, and not the Roman army. Easy as the victory is to be, however, we must remember that there is a great deal at stake in the contest. It is not merely for glory that we are now about to contend. If Hannibal conquers, he will march to Rome, and our wives, our children, and all that we hold dear will be at his mercy. Remember this, and go into the battle feeling that the fate of Rome itself is depending upon the result. An oration is attributed to Hannibal too on the occasion of this battle. He showed, however, his characteristic ingenuity and spirit of contrivance in the way in which he managed to attract strong attention to what he was going to say by the manner in which he introduced it. He formed his army into a circle, as if to witness a spectacle. He then brought in to the center of this circle a number of prisoners that he had taken among the Alps. Perhaps they were the hostages which had been delivered to him, as related in the preceding chapter. Whoever they were, however, whether hostages or captives taken in the battles which had been fought in the fields, Hannibal had brought them with his army down into Italy, and now, introducing them into the center of the circle which the army formed, he threw down before them such arms as they were accustomed to use in their native mountains, and asked them whether they would be willing to take those weapons and fight each other, on condition that each one who killed his antagonist should be restored to his liberty, and have a horse and armor given him, so that he could return home with honor. The barbarous monsters said readily that they would, and seized the arms with the greatest avidity. 2 or 3 pairs of combatants were allowed to fight. One of each pair was killed, and the other set at liberty according to the promise of Hannibal. The combats excited the greatest interest, and awakened the strongest enthusiasm among the soldiers who witnessed them. When this effect had been sufficiently produced, the rest of the prisoners were sent away, and Hannibal addressed the vast ring of soldiery as follows. I have intended, soldiers, in what you have now seen, not merely to amuse you, but to give you a picture of your own situation. You are hemmed in on the right and left by two seas, and you have not so much as a single ship upon either of them. Then there is the Po before you, and the Alps behind. The Po is a deeper and more rapid and turbulent river than the Rhone, and as for the Alps, it was with the utmost difficulty that you passed over them when you were in full strength and vigor. They are an insurmountable wall to you now. You are therefore shut in, like our prisoners, on every side, and have no hope of life and liberty but in battle and victory. The victory, however, will not be difficult. I see wherever I look among you a spirit of determination and courage which I am sure will make you conquerors. The troops which you are going to contend against are mostly fresh recruits that know nothing of the discipline of the camp, and can never successfully confront such war-worn veterans as you. You all know each other well, and me. I was in fact a pupil with you for many years before I took the command. But Scipio's forces are strangers to one another, and to him, and consequently have no common bond of sympathy. And as for Scipio himself, his very commission as a Roman general is only 6 months old. Think too what a splendid and prosperous career victory will open before you. It will conduct you to Rome. It will make you masters of one of the most powerful and wealthiest cities in the world. Thus far you have fought your battles only for glory or for dominion. Now you will have something more substantial to reward your success. There will be great treasures to be divided among you if we conquer. But if we are defeated, we are lost. Hemmed in as we are on every side, there is no place that we can reach by flight. There is, therefore, no such alternative as flight left to us. We must conquer. It is hardly probable that Hannibal could have really and honestly felt all the confidence that he expressed in his harangues to his soldiers. He must have had some fears. In fact, in all enterprises undertaken by men, the indications of success and the hopes based upon them will fluctuate from time to time, and cause his confidence in the result to ebb and flow, so that bright anticipations of success and triumph will alternate in his heart with feelings of discouragement and despondency. This effect is experienced by all, by the energetic and decided, as well as by the timid and the faltering. The former, however, never allow these fluctuations of hope and fear to influence their action. They consider well the substantial grounds for expecting success before commencing their undertaking, and then go steadily forward under all aspects of the sky, when it shines or when it rains, till they reach the end. The inefficient and undecided can act only under the stimulus of present hope. The end they aim at must be visibly before them all the time. If for a moment it passes out of view, their motive is gone, and they can do no more, till by some change in circumstances it comes in sight again. Hannibal was energetic and decided. The time for him to consider whether he would encounter the hostility of the Roman Empire arose to the highest possible degree was when his army was drawn up upon the banks of the Iberus, before they crossed it. The Iberus was his Rubicon. The line once overstepped, there was to be no further faltering. The difficulties which arose from time to time to throw a cloud over his prospects only seemed to stimulate him to fresh energy, and to awaken anew, though still a calm and steady resolution. It was so at the Pyrenees, it was so at the Rhone, it was so among the Alps, where the difficulties and daggers would have induced almost any other commander to have returned. and it was still so, now that he found himself shut in on every hand by the stand boundaries of northern Italy, which he could not possibly hope again to pass, and the whole disposable force of the Roman Empire, commanded too by one of the consuls, concentrated before him. The imminent danger produced no faltering, and apparently no fear. The armies were not yet in sight of each other. They were in fact yet on opposite sides of the river Po. The Roman commander concluded to march his troops across the river, and advanced in search of Hannibal, who was still at some miles' distance. After considering the various means of crossing the stream, he decided finally on building a bridge. Military commanders generally throw some sort of a bridge across a stream of water lying in their way, if it is too deep to be easily forded, unless, indeed, it is so wide and rapid as to make the construction of the bridge difficult or impracticable. In this latter case, they cross as well as they can by means of boats and rafts and by swimming. The Po, though not very large stream at this point, was too deep to be forded, and Scipio accordingly built the bridge. The soldiers cut down the trees which grew in the forest along the banks, and after trimming off the tops and branches, they rolled the trunks into the water. They placed these trunks side by side, with others laid transversely and pinned down upon the top. Thus they formed rafts, which they placed in a line across the stream, securing them well to each other and to the banks. This made the foundation for the bridge, and after this foundation was covered with other materials, so as to make the upper surface a convenient roadway, the army were conducted across it, and then a small detachment of soldiers was stationed at each extremity of it as a guard. Such a bridge as this answers a very good temporary purpose, and in still water, as for example of the narrow lakes or very sluggish streams, where there is very little current, a floating structure of this kind is sometimes built for permanent service. Such bridges will not, however, stand on broad and rapid rivers liable to floods. The pressure of the water alone in such cases would very much endanger all the fastenings, and in cases where drift wood or ice is brought down by the stream, the floating masses, not being able to pass under the bridge, would accumulate above it, and would soon bear upon it with so enormous a pressure that nothing could withstand its force. The bridge would be broken away, and the whole accumulation, bridge, drift, wood, and ice, would be borne irresistibly down the stream together. Scipio's bridge, however, answered very well for his purpose. His army passed over it in safety. When Hannibal heard of this, he knew that the battle was at hand. Hannibal was himself at this time about 5 miles distant. While Scipio was at work upon the bridge, Hannibal was employed, mainly, as he had been all the time since his descent from the mountains, in the subjugation of the various petty nations and tribes north of the Po. Some of them were well disposed to join his standard. Others were allies of the Romans, and wished to remain so. He made treaties and sent help to the former, and dispatched detachments of troops to intimidate and subdue the latter. When, however, he learned that Scipio had crossed the river, he ordered all these detachments to come immediately in, and he began to prepare in earnest for the contest that was impending. He called together an assembly of his soldiers, and announced to them finally that the battle was now nigh. He renewed the words of encouragement that he had spoken before, and in addition to what he then said, he now promised the soldiers rewards in land in case they proved victorious. "I will give you each a farm," said he, "wherever you choose to have it, either in Africa, Italy, or Spain. If instead of the land, any of you shall prefer to receive rather an equivalent in money, you should have the reward in that form, and then you can return home and live with your friends as before the war under circumstances which will make you objects of envy to those who remain behind. If any of you would like to live in Carthage, I will have you made free citizens, so that you can live there in independence and honor. But what security would there be for the faithful fulfillment of these promises? In modern times, such security is given by bonds, with pecuniary penalties, or by the deposit of titles to property in responsible hands. In ancient days, they managed differently. The promiser bound himself by some solemn and formal mode of adjuration, accompanied in important cases with certain ceremonies, which were supposed to seal and confirm the obligation assumed. In this case, Hannibal brought a lamb in the presence of the assembled army. He held it before them with his left hand, while with his right he grasped a heavy stone. He then called aloud upon the gods, imploring them to destroy him as he was about to slay the lamb, if he failed to perform faithfully and fully the pledges that he had made. He then struck the poor lamb a heavy blow with the stone. The animal fell dead at his feet, and Hannibal was thenceforth bound, in the opinion of the army, by a very solemn obligation indeed, to be faithful in fulfilling his word. The soldiers were greatly animated and excited by these promises, and were in haste to have the contest come on. The Roman soldiers, it seems, were in a different mood of mind. Some circumstances have occurred which they considered as bad omens, and they were very much dispirited and depressed by them. It is astonishing that men should ever allow their minds to be affected by such wholly accidental occurrences as these were. One of them was this. A wolf came into their camp from one of the forests near, and after wounding several men, made his escape again. The other was more trifling still. A swarm of bees flew into the encampment and lighted upon a tree just over Scipio's tent. This was considered, for some reason or other, a sign that some calamity was going to befall them, and the men were accordingly intimidated and disheartened. They consequently looked forward to the battle with uneasiness and anxiety, while the army of Hannibal anticipated it with eagerness and pleasure. The battle came on at last, very suddenly, and at a moment when neither party was expecting it. A large detachment of both armies were advancing toward the position of the other, near the river Ticinus, to reconnoiter, when they met and the battle began. Hannibal advanced with great impetuosity, and sent at the same time a detachment around to attack his enemy in the rear. The Romans soon began to fall into confusion. The horsemen and foot soldiers got entangled together. The men were trampled upon by the horses, and the horses were frightened by the men. In the midst of this scene, Scipio received a wound. A consul with a dignitary of very high consideration. He was in fact a sort of semi-king. The officers and all the soldiers, so fast as they heard that the consul was wounded, were terrified and dismayed, and the Romans began to retreat. Scipio had a young son, named also Scipio, who was then about 20 years of age. He was fighting by the side of his father when he received his wound. He protected his father, got him into the center of a compact body of cavalry, and moved slowly off the ground. those in the rear facing toward the enemy and beating them back as they pressed on in pursuit of them. In this way they reached their camp. Here they stopped for the night. They had fortified the place, and, as night was coming on, Hannibal thought it not prudent to press on and attack them there. He waited for the morning. Scipio, however, himself wounded and his army discouraged, thought it not prudent for him to wait till the morning. At midnight he put his whole force in motion on a retreat. He kept the campfires burning, and did everything else in his power to prevent the Carthaginians observing any indications of his departure. His army marched secretly and silently till they reached the river. They recrossed it by the bridge they had built, and then, cutting away the fastenings by which the different rafts were held together, the structure was at once destroyed, and the materials of which it was composed floated away, a mere mass of ruins down the stream. From the Ticinus they floated, we may imagine, into the Po, and thence down the Po into the Adriatic Sea, where they drifted about upon the waste of waters till they were at last, one after another, driven by storms upon the sandy shores. End of chapter 7.